Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead.
Have you ever felt a pull toward the unknown? This question lingered in my mind as I wandered deeper into the forest, the soft rustling of leaves beneath my boots the only sound accompanying me. It was supposed to be an ordinary hike, a way to escape the stress of the week and find solace in nature. But something about today felt different, as though the air itself carried an unspoken secret. I first noticed the trail after an hour of walking. It wasn't marked on any map, nor did it resemble the well-worn paths I had seen before. Narrow and almost overgrown, it seemed as though the forest itself had tried to hide it. My curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the main path and onto the hidden one. At first, it was just a trail like any other. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint scent of pine hung in the air. But as I ventured further, something began to change. The forest grew quieter. The birdsong faded until all I could hear was my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. I paused, glancing around. The trees seemed closer. Their trunks loomed tall and gnarled, their branches twisting like skeletal hands toward the sky. The trail itself was peculiar, too. No matter how far I walked, it remained the same, straight and narrow, with no visible end in sight. Doubt crept in. Am I just imagining things? I muttered aloud, my voice startlingly loud in the oppressive silence. To test the trail, I decided to turn back. But as I retraced my steps, a sense of unease took root. The scenery was eerily identical. Every rock, every fallen branch was in the exact same place. After walking for what felt like another 10 minutes, I realized I had returned to the very spot where I had first turned around. I froze. My heart began to race as I stared at the familiar curve in the path, the same moss-covered log I had stepped over moments ago. It didn't make sense. Maybe I took a wrong turn, I thought, though I knew it wasn't true. The trail was too narrow for that. Determined to break the loop, I chose a new direction, stepping off the trail entirely. The underbrush resisted, snagging at my clothes and scratching my hands. But when I emerged back onto the trail, because I inevitably did, it was as though I had never left. The same curve. The same log. Panic bubbled beneath the surface of my thoughts. This isn't normal. This isn't possible. My rational mind searched for answers, but none came. The quiet became oppressive, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you're sure you'll hear something, if only because the absence of sound is unbearable. And then I did hear something, a faint rustling, not far behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the trail. Nothing. Hello? My voice echoed, hollow and small. No reply came, but the rustling persisted, growing louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps. My pulse quickened. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Something, or someone, was following me. The sound of the footsteps stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving me frozen on the spot. I strained my ears, hoping, dreading, that it would return. Nothing. Just silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, scanning the trail behind me. The forest looked the same as before, quiet, empty, unchanging. But there was something about it now that felt wrong. The trees seemed darker, their twisted branches casting shadows that shifted unnaturally. Even the air felt heavier, as though it were pressing down on me, trying to hold me in place. "Focus," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "There's an explanation for this. There has to be." I decided to keep walking, forcing one foot in front of the other. The logical part of me clung to the idea that if I just kept moving, I'd eventually find the end of the trail. But with every step, the unease grew. The path stretched endlessly ahead, as though mocking my determination. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. A figure stood on the trail ahead, partially obscured by the dense trees. It was motionless, its outline faint and blurry, as though it didn't quite belong in the world I knew. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The figure didn't move. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But where would I go? The trail was a loop, it always brought me back to the same spot. And what if this figure was the key? What if it could tell me how to escape? Summoning what little courage I had left, I took a step toward it. "I don't mean any harm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just lost. Can you help me?" The figure still didn't move. But as I got closer, I began to notice details, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. Its outline was wrong, shifting subtly, as though it were made of smoke or shadow. And its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, an unnatural light that sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped, unable to take another step. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt unnervingly human. And then, without warning, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, no sound, no trace. Panic surged through me. I turned in a circle, scanning the forest for any sign of it. "Where are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the emptiness. "What do you want from me?" There was no reply, but the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. The air felt colder, biting at my skin despite the sweat dripping down my face. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breathing ragged and uneven. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Only this time, they weren't behind me. They were ahead, on the trail. Slow, deliberate, drawing closer with each passing second. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. "Stay back!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure who, or what, I was talking to. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then a voice, low and distorted, echoed through the trees. "You don't belong here." It wasn't a statement. It was a warning. The words echoed in my mind, chilling and heavy. "You don't belong here." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but fear choked the air from my lungs. The forest felt alive now, pressing in on me, its twisted trees leaning closer, their gnarled branches like clawed hands. The trail beneath my feet seemed to ripple, as if the ground itself was unstable. I needed to move, but where? The figure had vanished again, and the footsteps had stopped. The only sound was the frantic thudding of my own heart. I turned and ran. It didn't matter where, I just needed to move, to escape the oppressive weight of the silence and the unseen eyes that I was sure were watching. My boots pounded against the dirt, and the forest blurred around me. The trail twisted and turned, but it never split. There was no way out. Then, as I rounded a bend, my worst fear was confirmed. The same moss-covered log, the same gnarled tree leaning at an awkward angle, it was all there, just as before. The trail had brought me back again. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." I kicked at the log, anger and panic bubbling to the surface. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. The forest didn't care about my disbelief. It loomed silently, unchanging, impenetrable. I sat down on the log, burying my face in my hands. "Think," I muttered to myself. "There has to be a way out. There's always a way out." But no matter how much I tried to focus, my thoughts were a jumbled mess. My breathing grew shallow, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. A sound broke through the silence, a low, guttural growl. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, reverberating through the forest. I shot to my feet, scanning the trees. The growl was everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me like a predator circling its prey. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Show yourself." The forest didn't answer, but the growl shifted, morphing into something worse, a distorted, inhuman voice. "You cannot leave." The words were drawn out, each syllable dripping with malice. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move, backing away slowly. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for the source of the voice. And then I saw it again. The figure. It was closer this time, standing directly on the trail ahead. Its form was clearer now, tall and gaunt, its outline flickering like a dying flame. Its eyes burned with an unnatural glow, locking onto mine. "You're not real," I whispered, more to myself than to it. "You're not real." The figure took a step toward me. I stumbled back, nearly falling. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the air around me had thickened, holding me in place. The voice came again, this time from the figure itself. "The path is not yours to walk." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free from its gaze. But all I could do was stand there, frozen, as it continued to approach. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, the trail dissolving into shadows. And then the world tilted. I felt myself falling, though I wasn't sure where. The forest, the trail, the figure, they all blurred together, spinning into a chaotic swirl of darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the voice, low and mocking. "There is no escape." I woke to darkness, but it wasn't the kind you experience at night. This was suffocating, thick like a blanket wrapped around me. My limbs felt heavy, my body sinking into the ground as if the forest were trying to swallow me whole. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, then the memories came rushing back. The trail. The figure. The voice. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. The oppressive silence had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something unseen, something watching. My fingers dug into the dirt beneath me as I tried to ground myself, but the earth felt strange, cold, almost slimy, and pulsing faintly, like it was alive. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky but functional. The trail was still there, faintly visible in the dim light filtering through the trees. Or was it? The forest had changed. The trees were closer, their trunks impossibly tall and their branches interlocking above, creating a canopy that blocked out the sky. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision, shifting and twisting as though they had a will of their own. "Keep moving," I whispered to myself. My voice sounded foreign, like it didn't belong to me. "Just keep moving." I began to walk, each step feeling heavier than the last. The forest resisted me, its roots curling upward to snag at my boots, its branches swaying unnaturally low to brush against my face. The trail curved sharply, leading me into an area where the air felt colder, biting at my skin. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. They were faint, distant, but unmistakable. They weren't behind me this time. They were all around. I spun in a circle, my breathing quickening. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, and I hated the fear in it. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by another sound, whispers. They were unintelligible at first, like wind rustling through leaves, but soon they became clearer. Dozens of voices, speaking all at once, overlapping and chaotic. "Turn back. Stay. Run. Never leave." The words pounded in my head, each one conflicting with the next, pulling me in every direction at once. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside me. "Stop it!" I screamed. "Leave me alone." The voices didn't stop, but the forest responded. The ground beneath me began to tremble, cracks forming in the dirt. Black tendrils emerged, writhing like snakes, reaching for my feet. I stumbled back, barely avoiding them, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the tendrils stretched higher, twisting toward me. And then I saw it, the figure. It stood at the edge of the trail, motionless, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. I backed away, but the tendrils blocked my path. "What do you want from me?" I shouted at the figure, desperation creeping into my voice. "Why are you doing this?" It didn't respond, but the shadows around it began to move, coalescing into shapes. They weren't human, not anymore. Twisted forms with elongated limbs and hollow eyes emerged, their movements jerky and unnatural. Panic overtook me. I turned and ran, ignoring the voices and the tendrils, ignoring the fact that the trail was a loop and I'd likely end up back where I started. I just needed to get away. But the forest wouldn't let me go. The ground shifted beneath my feet, throwing me off balance. The shadows closed in, their whispers becoming a deafening roar. And then the figure's voice cut through it all, cold and commanding. "You belong to the path now." I fell to my knees, my strength drained. The forest seemed to press in on me from all sides, its darkness suffocating. And as the tendrils wrapped around my arms, pulling me into the earth, I realized the truth. There was no way out. The trail wasn't just a loop. It was a trap. The tendrils coiled tighter, their cold grip leaching the warmth from my body. I clawed at the ground, trying to resist, but the earth crumbled beneath my fingers, offering no hold. My screams echoed into the oppressive silence, swallowed almost immediately by the darkness surrounding me. I was sinking, dragged down inch by inch. My vision blurred as panic overtook me, but in the chaos, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath wasn't just dirt. It was shifting, alive, pulsating like the surface of a black ocean. Faces formed and dissolved in the undulating darkness, their mouths open in silent cries. "Help me!" I screamed, though I didn't know who I was calling for. The figure appeared again, closer this time, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It stood at the edge of the writhing void, its form more distinct now. The longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't a single entity. It was made of countless shadows, layered together, shifting and writhing like a mass of trapped souls. "You were warned," it said, its voice resonating in my skull like an unbearable pressure. "The path is not yours. You chose to walk it. Now you belong to it." "No!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "I didn't choose this. I didn't know." The figure tilted its head, almost as if in mockery. "Ignorance does not absolve you." The tendrils pulled harder, and I sank further. My chest was nearly submerged, my arms pinned at my sides. Desperation surged within me, and I fought with everything I had, but it was useless. The forest was alive, its will stronger than mine. "Please!" I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I'll leave. I'll never come back." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a shadowy hand, and the forest around me seemed to pulse, the trees bending inward, their branches forming an inescapable cage. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words overlapping in a cacophony of despair. "Stay. Join us. There is no escape." My vision darkened, the world around me dissolving into blackness. The last thing I saw was the figure stepping closer, its eyes burning brighter, consuming everything in their glow. And then, silence. When I awoke, I was lying on the forest floor. The air was still, the sunlight filtering softly through the trees. Everything was quiet, eerily normal. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my mind reeling. The trail stretched out before me, just as it had when I first found it. For a brief moment, I thought it might have been a nightmare. But as I looked down at my hands, I saw dark stains on my skin, black, like the tendrils that had pulled me into the earth. They didn't wash off when I rubbed them. They were part of me now. I stood, my legs unsteady, and glanced around. The forest felt different, emptier somehow, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail was still there, beckoning, its endless loop waiting for me to step back onto it. I tried to leave. I really did. But no matter which direction I walked, no matter how far I went, the trail always brought me back. And now, as I sit here, writing this, if anyone ever finds it, I have only one warning. Do not step off the path. And if you see the figure, turn back. Because once you're here, you'll never truly leave. It began with a faint rustle. I had been sitting in my small apartment, the dim glow of the television flickering against the walls, when I heard it for the first time. A sound that seemed to emerge from the ventilation duct above the couch. At first, I dismissed it as the usual hum of an aging building, pipes shifting, wind rattling through unseen cracks. But then it came again, sharper this time, almost deliberate. I muted the TV, tilting my head toward the vent. Silence. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But just as I was about to turn the sound back on, it happened again, a faint, scraping noise, as if something were moving inside. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I lived alone, on the 11th floor of an old high-rise. The idea of anything being inside the ventilation system, let alone something alive, seemed ridiculous. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Probably just rats, I muttered to myself, though the words did little to ease my unease. The building wasn't exactly known for its upkeep. Still, the thought of vermin crawling through the ducts above me was enough to make my skin crawl. I stood on the couch, peering into the slatted vent cover. The dim light made it impossible to see anything beyond the metal grates. The air from the vent felt cool against my face, carrying with it the faint, musty smell of old dust. "You're imagining things," I told myself, stepping down. But as the night wore on, the sound persisted. It wasn't constant, sometimes hours would pass without a noise. But just when I began to relax, to convince myself it was nothing, it would return. A soft scrape, a gentle tap, like fingernails against metal. By midnight, I was too unnerved to sleep. Every creak of the apartment, every shift in the shadows seemed magnified, more sinister. I closed my bedroom door, locking it for the first time since moving in. It felt silly, childish even, but it gave me a small sense of control. The noise didn't follow me to the bedroom, or if it did, I couldn't hear it over the pounding of my heart. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I tried to put the events of the previous night behind me. With the sun streaming through the windows, the fear seemed irrational, almost laughable. I busied myself with errands, spending as little time in the apartment as possible. But as night fell, the oppressive silence returned, and with it, the sound. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It didn't sound like rats. It sounded like something heavier, something moving purposefully through the vents. I grabbed a flashlight and stood on the couch again, shining the beam into the darkness beyond the vent. For a moment, all I saw was dust and cobwebs. But then something glinted, something small and metallic, lodged deep within the duct. My heart skipped a beat as recognition struck. It was a chain, a delicate silver one with a tiny charm hanging from it. My silver chain. I hadn't seen it in years. I thought I'd lost it in the move. But how could it have ended up here, inside the ventilation system? A creeping unease settled over me as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the vent cover. The sound came again, this time directly behind the grate. A low, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the metal. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound stopped. And then, from deep within the vent, came a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Come closer." I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper was faint, almost like a breeze slipping through the vent, but the words were unmistakable. My first instinct was to step away, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was inside. But my chain! It didn't make sense. How could something I'd lost years ago be here? I felt a strange pull, a need to retrieve it, even though every rational part of my mind screamed to leave it alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The absurdity of speaking to a vent wasn't lost on me, but in that moment, fear and curiosity had taken hold. No response. I climbed off the couch and grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. My hands trembled as I loosened the screws on the vent cover. Each turn of the tool seemed to amplify the oppressive silence in the room. Finally, the cover came free. I set it aside, shining the flashlight into the dark, narrow passage. The chain glinted just out of reach, tangled around something deeper in the duct. The rational part of me begged to stop. But something about seeing that chain, a piece of my past, something I thought lost forever, made me feel like I had to retrieve it. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the cool metal. The moment I touched it, a sharp chill shot through my arm, like ice coursing through my veins. I yanked my hand back, gasping. The chain hadn't moved, but now it seemed farther away, deeper in the vent than before. That's impossible, I thought. It's just an illusion, a trick of the light. Determined, I leaned in closer, pushing my arm further into the duct. The air inside was freezing, and the metallic walls seemed to hum faintly, a vibration I could feel in my bones. My fingers grazed the chain again, and I grabbed hold, tugging gently. It wouldn't budge. Frustration bubbled up, overriding my fear. I pulled harder, twisting the chain to free it from whatever it was caught on. That's when I felt it, a resistance, as though someone, or something, on the other end was holding it. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The chain slipped free suddenly, sending me stumbling backward. I stared at the tangled metal in my hand, a strange sense of triumph mingling with unease. But the feeling didn't last. From deep within the vent came a noise, a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving, dragging itself closer. I scrambled back, clutching the chain tightly. My flashlight beam flickered, illuminating the darkness inside the duct. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shape, pale and angular, slithering toward the opening. I slammed the vent cover back into place, my fingers fumbling with the screws. The growling stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. When I finally secured the cover, I stumbled away, collapsing onto the couch. The chain was still in my hand, its charm glinting faintly in the dim light. It looked exactly as I remembered, but the metal felt unnaturally cold, as though it had been lying in ice. What was that? I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. I glanced at the vent, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. The silence persisted, oppressive and heavy, wrapping around me like a shroud. I should have thrown the chain away, left it there, and forgotten about it. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I held onto it, staring at the charm and wondering what I had just unleashed. Let me know when you're ready for the next chapter. The tension is only beginning to rise. I didn't sleep that night. The chain sat on the table in front of me, its cold presence filling the room with an inexplicable weight. Every so often, I glanced at the vent, half expecting to hear that growl again, or worse, see something emerge. But the silence remained, unnerving and oppressive. By dawn, exhaustion had settled over me, but the daylight brought no relief. The bright, familiar glow of the sun failed to chase away the unease that had taken root in my chest. I decided to leave the apartment for a while, to clear my head and convince myself that it had all been a product of stress and lack of sleep. But even as I wandered through the city, the feeling lingered, a constant, gnawing awareness that I wasn't truly alone. When I returned home, the apartment felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows in the corners darker than they should have been. And then I noticed it. The vent cover was slightly ajar. I froze in the doorway, my breath catching. I was certain I had secured it tightly the night before. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, it's just loose. It's an old building." But my hands trembled as I stepped closer. The screws were still in place, but the cover had been pushed outward as though something inside had tried to force its way out. My stomach churned. I grabbed a chair and a roll of duct tape, pressing the cover firmly back into place and sealing every edge. I didn't care if it looked ridiculous, I just wanted to feel safe. That night, the noises returned. It started with the faint scraping again, soft but deliberate. Then came the tapping, rhythmic and insistent, as though something was testing the barriers I had created. I sat on the couch, gripping the chain tightly in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the apartment and never look back. But I stayed, paralyzed by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the room. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I strained to hear any sign of movement, my heart pounding in my ears. And then, I saw it. A shadow flickered across the ceiling, just above the vent. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, but it moved, slowly, deliberately, stretching and shifting like it had a life of its own. My breath hitched as the shadow grew darker, pooling like ink spreading across the walls. It didn't make sense. There was no light source to cast such a shape. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have taken it." The voice was low and guttural, vibrating through the air and into my chest. It wasn't coming from the vent. It was all around me, seeping into the very walls. "What do you want?" I whispered, clutching the chain so tightly it bit into my palm. The shadow shifted again, elongating into a vaguely humanoid form. It had no features, just an outline of darkness, its presence more oppressive than anything I'd ever felt. "Return what is ours," it growled. I looked down at the chain, its charm gleaming faintly in the dim light. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The chain had been mine. It was a gift from my grandmother, something I treasured until I lost it. How could it belong to whatever this was? "I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "This is mine. It's always been mine." The figure loomed closer, its form expanding to fill the room. The air grew colder, and I felt an unbearable pressure in my chest, as though the very space around me was collapsing. "Return it," the voice demanded again, more forceful this time. I backed away, clutching the chain tighter. "No! I won't!" The shadow paused, its edges flickering like flames. For a moment, the room was completely still. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. In the suffocating darkness, the growl returned, louder and closer than ever. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, circling me, pressing in from all sides. And in that moment, I realized there was no escaping this. Let me know if you're ready for the next chapter. The tension is nearing its breaking point. The darkness was absolute, swallowing every trace of light. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to illuminate the room, but my shaking hands dropped it. The clatter echoed unnaturally, as if the sound were stretching and distorting in the oppressive void. The growl deepened, a guttural rumble that vibrated through the floor and up into my chest. It was no longer just a noise, it was alive, sentient, circling me like a predator sizing up its prey. Why are you doing this? I screamed, clutching the chain so tightly that the charm dug into my palm. What do you want from me? The growl stopped. For a moment, the silence returned, even more deafening than the noise. And then the voice came again, low and deliberate. You took what does not belong to you. The words sent a chill through me. My grip loosened, and I stared at the chain, its faint glow the only thing visible in the suffocating dark. Memories of my grandmother flickered in my mind, her soft smile, the way her hands trembled as she fastened the chain around my neck for the first time. It was hers before it was mine. How could it not belong to me? It's mine! I shouted, desperation lacing my voice. The shadow figure emerged from the darkness again, this time more defined, its form towering and inhuman. It had no face, only a swirling void where its features should have been, yet I felt its gaze piercing through me. You claimed it, it said, the words reverberating in the cold air. But it was never truly yours. Return it, and you will be free. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I don't believe you. The room trembled, the walls groaning as if the building itself were alive and angry. The shadow surged forward, engulfing me in its freezing presence. My breath hitched, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. The chain burned in my hand now, its icy cold replaced by a searing heat. I screamed, dropping it to the floor. The shadow recoiled slightly, its form flickering. You cannot keep what is not yours, it hissed. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The chain lay in front of me, its glow intensifying, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. My mind raced. If I gave it back, would this nightmare end? Or would it take something else from me? I can't, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. It's all I have left of her. The shadow paused, its flickering form growing still. For the first time, it seemed less menacing, almost contemplative. But then it surged forward again, its voice booming with fury. You cannot bargain with what is already claimed. The chain lifted from the ground, floating between us, its glow pulsating like a heartbeat. I reached for it, but the shadow lashed out, a tendril of darkness coiling around my wrist. Pain shot through me, cold and sharp, as though my very essence were being drained. Stop! I screamed, struggling against its grip. The room shook violently, the air thick with the scent of burning metal and something far older, far darker. The chain pulsed brighter, blindingly so, and then a deafening crack split the air. The shadow let out a guttural roar, its form disintegrating into wisps of smoke. The chain fell to the floor with a heavy thud, its glow fading into dull silver. I collapsed, my body trembling. The darkness receded slowly, the dim light of the street lamp outside filtering through the blinds. The room was silent once more. But as I lay there, clutching my wrist and staring at the chain, a single, horrifying realization settled over me. This wasn't over. Not yet. The night seemed endless. I sat motionless, staring at the chain, still lying on the floor. The eerie glow had faded completely, and now it looked like nothing more than a relic of a past I had almost forgotten. But even as the silence settled over the room, the unease didn't lift. The air felt heavier, as though something was waiting, just beyond my reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow, whatever it was, hadn't truly gone. It was still here, in the walls, in the very air I breathed. I reached for the chain, my fingers brushing against the cool metal, but I hesitated. My mind screamed to throw it away, to rid myself of its cursed presence. But my hand couldn't move, as if something invisible was holding it there. The faintest sound reached my ears, a scraping, almost imperceptible, like something scratching its way through the walls. I froze. My pulse quickened, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I couldn't tell if it was just the house settling or something far worse. Then came the whisper. "Return it." The voice was close this time, so close I could feel the words reverberate in my chest. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, twisting into shapes that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "No," I muttered, barely able to hear myself over the pounding in my ears. "It's mine. I can't." The room grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply. I wrapped my arms around myself, my breath misting in the air. The chain, once a symbol of comfort and love, now felt like a weight, like a curse that would drag me under. I had been wrong. I knew that now. The shadow hadn't been lying. I hadn't just taken something that didn't belong to me. I had taken something far older, far darker. I glanced around, feeling the walls closing in on me. The house, the very building, felt alive, breathing, shifting, groaning under the weight of its secrets. And then the voice came again, louder this time, a snarl that filled the space. "Return what you stole." I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I felt trapped, as though the very room was pressing against me, pushing me into the corner. The vent, the shadow, the chain, none of it made sense, but it didn't matter anymore. It was real. I picked up the chain, and before I even realized what I was doing, I walked toward the vent. My hand trembled as I unscrewed the cover. The scraping grew louder, frantic now, as if the thing behind the walls could sense what I was doing. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. With the chain in my hand, I held it out toward the vent, offering it back to whatever force had claimed it. A horrible chill ran down my spine as I placed it on the cold metal, feeling its burn as if the shadows were trying to pull it back. "Take it," I whispered. For a moment, everything was still. The scraping stopped. The shadows in the corners seemed to freeze, suspended in time. And then, with a sudden, violent force, the chain was yanked from my hand. I screamed, stumbling backward as the vent cover slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The room felt empty now. The air was thick with silence, and the oppressive weight lifted, leaving me gasping for breath. I didn't know what I had returned it to. I didn't care. The nightmare was over. At least, that's what I tried to believe. But as I sat there, staring at the now still vent, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was subtle, like a faint pressure on the back of my neck. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone, even when you can't see anyone. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something in the corner of the room. A faint, flickering shadow, barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there. And I knew it was waiting. The static crackled as I adjusted the dial, trying to find something, anything, to break the silence in my apartment. The hum of the radio was usually a comforting backdrop to my evenings, but tonight it felt off, like the air had thickened somehow. I had just moved into this building a few months ago, and there were still some boxes I hadn't unpacked. Everything felt temporary, unfinished. But then, as I scrolled through the stations, I stopped. A voice, clear and crisp, cut through the static, unlike anything I'd heard before on the radio. "It's cold tonight, isn't it, Sarah?" I froze. The voice was calm, almost friendly, but it was speaking to me. No one knew my name here. "What the hell?" I muttered, leaning closer to the radio. The voice continued, smooth as ever. "You're sitting in your living room now, staring at the box in front of you. The one with your old books. It's a mess, isn't it? You keep meaning to organize it, but never do. But tonight is different, isn't it?" I recoiled, my hand trembling on the dial. Was someone in the room with me? No, the voice was coming from the radio, but it felt so real, as though the speaker was standing right behind me. "Your coffee mug is on the table, a little chipped, just like your favorite one that broke last year," the voice continued. "The one you cried over for a week." I stood up so quickly that my chair tipped over, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. My heart was pounding in my chest. How did they know these things? I turned off the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It was still there, faintly, a hum in the background, like a distant whisper. "Don't turn it off." "I can hear you, too, Sarah," the voice whispered, as though it were inside my head. I could feel the blood drain from my face. This wasn't normal. There was no way this was some kind of coincidence. I was about to get up and leave the room when the voice spoke again, its tone sharp and clear. "You can't leave yet, Sarah. You haven't finished what you started." My breath caught in my throat. What did it mean? I reached for my phone, my hands unsteady, to check the time, to see if this was some prank or some sort of strange transmission glitch. But when I glanced at the screen, it was covered in a strange, unfamiliar message. "You're being watched." I dropped my phone, the screen shattering on the floor. The sudden crash seemed to shatter the moment of stillness, but the voice only grew stronger. "You're scared now, aren't you? But this is just the beginning. You're not alone, Sarah." The voice paused, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it was over. But then, it came back, this time with an eerie calmness. "Look behind you." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faintest flicker of something moving just beyond the corner of my vision. Something dark, shifting, like a shadow that didn't quite belong. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I was no longer alone in my apartment. And whoever, or whatever, was speaking to me was far too close for comfort. The voice spoke again, softer now, almost like it was consoling me. "It's already begun. You'll see soon enough." But I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know. I reached for the radio again, but as my fingers brushed against the dial, it flickered and went silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of my rapid breathing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was still there, watching. Waiting. The voice was gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. And that was when I realized the worst part. I couldn't remember turning the radio off. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The silence was oppressive, like a thick blanket smothering the room. My heart still raced, the thudding against my ribs almost drowning out the hum of the apartment's old pipes. I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone, not just in the room, but in my own mind. I glanced nervously toward the radio, still sitting there in the corner of the room, as if nothing had happened. I should have turned it off. I should have thrown it out the window the second the voice started talking to me. But I didn't. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as the words, my name, my life, were torn out of me and spilled into the air. I needed to do something. I needed to figure out who, or what, was on the other side of that radio. My mind raced as I paced back and forth, the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the walls. Could this be some kind of broadcast? A prank? Maybe it was some elaborate social experiment, one of those reality shows. But as the events from the radio kept swirling in my thoughts, the details felt far too specific. Far too personal. The voice had known things no one could know. I walked slowly toward the radio, as if expecting it to react in some way, like it was alive, watching me. There it sat, its plastic surface gleaming under the dim light. I took a breath and reached out to switch it on, half expecting the voice to speak the moment my fingers made contact. But nothing happened. I stared at the dial for a long moment, my stomach twisting. Just when I thought the moment had passed, when I thought maybe I had imagined the entire thing, the static returned. The radio crackled. A long, drawn-out noise, followed by a familiar voice. "Don't touch that dial, Sarah." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How could it be back so soon? You think you're alone, but you're not. You think you can escape this, but you can't. The voice was steady, its tone cold, almost clinical. I see you. I know everything about you. My hand shook as I stepped back, the room closing in on me. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't listen to this thing anymore. But even as I turned toward the door, the voice kept speaking, its words wrapping around me, pulling me back. You're not going anywhere, Sarah. I spun around, my skin prickling with cold. There was no way this was possible. No one could know this much about me. No one could have this kind of power. Let me go! I shouted, my voice cracking. But the voice only laughed softly. You're already here. And you'll stay, too. You think you have control, but this is my game now. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door, hands fumbling with the knob, but it wouldn't open. I pulled harder, panic creeping into my chest. The doorknob rattled in my grip, but the door didn't budge. I was trapped. Don't bother, Sarah. You're where I want you, the voice murmured, its calmness now making my skin crawl. I stepped back from the door, my mind spiraling. What was this thing? Was it even a thing at all? My pulse quickened as I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something, someone, step out from the shadows. But there was nothing. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let whatever this was control me. But as I turned back to the radio, the voice spoke once more, almost too quietly for me to hear, as though it was speaking directly into my ear. You'll regret not listening. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't safe. The room felt smaller now. Or maybe it was just me. The air seemed heavier, and every little sound, a car passing by outside, the ticking of the clock on the wall, was amplified, as if the very walls were closing in. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape it. I stood there, staring at the radio, my hand still shaking from when I tried to open the door. The voice hadn't just spoken from the speakers anymore. It felt like it was inside me, in my head, whispering things I couldn't shake. "You'll regret not listening," it had said. What did that mean? What was it going to make me do? I was shaking now, not just with fear, but with anger. I had to get out. I had to do something. The voice, though, was relentless. "Do you want to know how I know you?" it asked, its tone almost like a lullaby, soft and coaxing, like it was trying to lull me into a false sense of calm. I didn't answer. I couldn't. "You remember the day your father left, don't you? How it felt to be abandoned, to be left in that cold house, the silence stretching for days after he was gone?" I gasped, the memory flashing before my eyes like a film reel. That day. I could still hear the door slamming behind him. I was just a child. I hadn't even understood what was happening back then, only that I felt an aching emptiness, like something inside me had snapped. The voice continued, relentless. "You remember when you found his letter? The one you never told anyone about? It's in the bottom drawer, Sarah. You still have it, don't you?" I gasped, my hand instinctively reaching for my throat as if I could stop it from breathing the secrets it shouldn't know. That letter, the one my father had written but never sent. How did it know? How could it possibly? No one knew about it, Sarah. No one except you. Except me. The voice sent a shiver through me, a bone-deep chill. I wanted to scream, to throw the radio out the window, to shut it all out. But the words kept coming, unstoppable, as if the very air around me was filled with its presence. "It's funny, isn't it?" the voice continued. "How everything you've ever hidden, everything you've tried to forget, is still there. Just waiting. All I have to do is remember for you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to destroy that radio, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear myself away. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, trapped in a web of memories I didn't want to face. The voice seemed to revel in my silence, as if it fed off my fear. "Do you want to know something else, Sarah? Something you've forgotten?" I clenched my fists. "You never really left that cold house. You still live there, you know. You've been carrying it with you all this time." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I swayed, dizzy, feeling the walls of the room close in. Was this some sort of twisted mind game? Some elaborate, cruel joke? No. It wasn't a joke. It couldn't be. This thing knew me in a way no one else ever had. I had to do something. I had to fight back. But how could I fight against something that already knew everything about me? "Do you want to run, Sarah? Do you think you can escape? You can't run from me. I'm already in your head. And I'll be here, every step of the way." The room seemed to warp around me. The shadows grew longer, darker, pressing in on me. My mind screamed for release, but my body was paralyzed. I couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The radio went quiet, the silence crushing in around me like a weight. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the next word, the next sound. But there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the radio, mocking me with its quiet. I didn't know if I was grateful or terrified. But as I looked around the room, something changed. It wasn't the same. The walls felt closer, the air felt thicker. And just as my heart rate began to settle, I realized what had happened. The voice hadn't stopped. It had just changed locations. I turned slowly, the blood draining from my face. The voice was no longer coming from the radio. It was coming from behind me. I didn't dare turn around at first. The air seemed to freeze, hanging between every breath I took. The faint static buzzed from the radio, but the voice, that voice, was unmistakable. It wasn't in front of me anymore. It was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere closer. I felt my heart skip a beat. The hairs on my neck stood straight as I stood frozen, every inch of my body screaming for movement, for action, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. You thought you were alone, didn't you, Sarah? The voice was closer now, almost whispering in my ear. I could feel the words brushing against my skin, cold and unsettling. I closed my eyes, hoping that if I didn't see it, it wouldn't be real. But it didn't work. The words kept coming, relentless, invading my thoughts. You think you can escape, but you can't, Sarah. I'm inside your head. I'm inside your walls. My pulse pounded in my temples. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this place. But there was no way out. The door was locked, and the windows were too high for me to climb out of. I forced myself to take a slow, shaky breath. I had to face it. I couldn't let fear take control. But when I finally turned, the room seemed different. It wasn't just the sound of the voice that had changed, the entire atmosphere had shifted. The walls seemed to have grown closer, the light dimming around me. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped not just by the walls, but by the air itself. I stumbled backward, my hand hitting the edge of the table as I tried to steady myself. The voice was still there, following me. Don't turn away, Sarah. I want you to listen. The chill in my spine deepened. I wanted to run, to break out of the confines of this nightmare, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I turned again, and my eyes locked on the old mirror hanging on the far wall. The reflection wasn't quite right, distorted somehow. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was me, but something about my image was wrong. The reflection didn't match my movements perfectly. It was like a delay, a moment's hesitation before it mirrored what I was doing. I couldn't look away. You still don't get it, do you, Sarah? You think you're in control. You think you have a choice. The voice was growing louder now, as if it was pressing against the walls themselves, coming from every direction. Look at yourself. Look at what you've become. The reflection in the mirror shifted. My own face twisted in a way that didn't belong to me, my lips curled up into a grin that was not my own, my eyes hollow and empty. My reflection was mocking me. I gasped, stumbling back, but the figure in the mirror didn't move with me. It stayed rooted, its smile widening. No, Sarah. You can't run from what's inside you. The voice chuckled, low and hollow. You've always known it was there. I backed up against the wall, my mind scrambling for an explanation, for something, anything that would make sense of what was happening. I had to get away from that mirror. I forced myself to look away, my hands gripping my head as if I could tear out the thoughts the voice was planting in my mind. The voice continued, no longer just a whisper now, but a constant, overwhelming presence. You remember that night, don't you? The night you found something you weren't supposed to? The night you listened too closely to the wrong thing? The memory hit me like a freight train, and I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I did remember. I had tried to bury it, tried to forget, but the voice had brought it all back. I had been there when it all began. I had heard that strange noise in the walls of the old house when I was a child. A whisper, a voice, soft at first. I thought it was just my imagination, but now I knew it hadn't been. I was always there, Sarah, the voice murmured. I've always been there. I couldn't take it anymore. My breath was coming in sharp gasps, my mind screaming at me to do something, to escape. But the voice followed me, pushed in closer, until it filled every corner of the room. And then I heard it, the faintest sound. A scraping, coming from the walls. A low, guttural noise that seemed to move, to shift, like something was crawling, pressing its way through the very space around me. I could feel it. I could feel it getting closer. I turned, desperate, looking for a way out, but the door was still locked. The windows still too high. The walls were closing in. I couldn't breathe. The scraping continued. Closer. Closer. And then, from the dark corner of the room, I heard the voice again. I'm inside the walls, Sarah. You can't hide from me. I was suffocating. Every breath felt like it was filled with the oppressive weight of the walls around me, pressing down, pushing in. The sound from the walls, the scraping, the shuffling, the gnawing noise, had grown louder, more frantic. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence. Something was moving, something was crawling inside the very structure of the room, closing in on me. The voice, the thing that had invaded my mind, was no longer a whisper. It was clear. It was like it had found its place inside my head, crawling into my thoughts like a parasite. There was no escape. Sarah, why do you still think you can hide? You've been listening to me for so long, you already know what I am. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had consumed the room. The radio was still playing, the static crackling in the background, but there was no music now, only that voice, now booming with an overwhelming force. I looked at the mirror once more, but this time, I couldn't recognize myself at all. The reflection had stopped mimicking me. It was moving on its own. It was the one in control now, a twisted mockery of everything I had once been. I couldn't look away. You're mine now, the voice purred. It was no longer a question. It was a declaration. Everything you've ever known, it's all part of me now. I tried to move, to step away, but the walls seemed to twist, the floor buckling beneath my feet. The air felt thick, suffocating, like something unseen was crawling through it, something dark, something old. The scraping in the walls was joined now by a low hum, a vibration that rattled my bones. It felt as if the entire building was alive, as if it was breathing with me, but it wasn't breathing for me. I looked back at the radio. The static was louder now, almost deafening. The speaker, the strange voice that had been narrating my life, was no longer just in my head. It was coming from the radio, distorting with every word, blending with the noises in the walls. The door behind me creaked, slowly at first, then faster, as if something was pushing from the other side. I turned to face it, my heart slamming in my chest, my thoughts racing. There was no time to run. I couldn't even scream anymore. Then, with a violent jolt, the door burst open. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me, and I landed hard on the floor. The room was spinning, the air thick with dread. The voice in my head wasn't just speaking anymore. It was laughing, low and guttural, echoing through the walls, through the radio, through the very air around me. The figure appeared in the doorway. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. It was a shadow of something, a shape, a distortion that twisted in on itself, a mix of light and dark, constantly shifting, like the reflection in a broken mirror. It stood there for a long moment, its presence filling the space with a suffocating heaviness. "You've always been part of this," it whispered, its voice no longer the voice I'd heard on the radio, but something much darker, much deeper. "I just had to wait for you to remember. I wanted to move, to get away, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped." The voice filled my thoughts, my senses, until there was nothing left of me but the thing in the doorway. "You'll be my final story, Sarah," it said, its voice now a mix of malice and amusement. "The world will forget you, but I'll never forget you." And then, the room went silent. The air went still. I blinked once, and when I opened my eyes again, everything had changed. The walls weren't there anymore. The room I had been in, the radio, the strange voice, all of it was gone. There was only darkness. I felt cold. My body was stiff, like it had been frozen in place. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The darkness pressed in, and then nothing. The radio went silent. The voice was gone. The scraping, the shifting sound in the walls, it all stopped. There was only silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It wasn't calming. It was empty. I realized then that I had never been in control. The voice had always been there, always watching, always waiting. And now, I was nothing. Just another lost story. But somewhere, deep in the silence, I could almost hear it again. A faint whisper, growing louder. A voice I couldn't escape. "You can never escape me, Sarah." And then, the radio crackled one last time. The broadcast had ended. The rain had been pouring down relentlessly for hours. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, swiping back and forth in a futile dance, blurring the already faded lights of the road. I was driving alone, like I often did on nights like this. The roads were deserted, the usual commuters nowhere to be seen. The storm had cleared the streets, and I was left to navigate this wet, lonely stretch of highway in the dead of night. As I drove, the low hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, and the occasional crackle of the radio. The storm made everything feel more isolated. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen anyone else on the road. It was a feeling of emptiness, one that I knew well. But it didn't bother me tonight. Then, I saw her. A figure in the rain. Her silhouette barely visible through the sheets of water falling from the sky. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, a shadow cast by the trees along the road. But as I got closer, it became clear, a woman standing by the side of the highway, soaked to the bone. My car slowed as I approached her. It was instinct, a desire to help, or maybe it was just the eerie emptiness of the storm driving me to make some sort of connection. I stopped. She didn't look up, didn't move as I pulled to a stop beside her. My window was rolled down just enough to speak without the rain flooding inside. "Need a lift?" I asked. Her head turned slowly, almost mechanically. Her face was pale, water running in rivulets down her cheeks. She had long, dark hair plastered to her face, and her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. She nodded, her eyes dark and distant. Without a word, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the isolation. But there was something strange about the way she looked at me, as if she was studying me, as if she knew me. "You're wet," I said, glancing over at her. "You okay?" She didn't answer. She just sat there, still and silent, staring ahead. I could feel the air grow heavier with her presence, but I brushed it off. I was just tired from the drive, and maybe the storm was playing with my mind. The rain intensified. The sound of it against the car grew louder, filling the space around us, drowning out everything else. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I focused on the road, the rain streaking down the windshield, and her sitting still beside me. I glanced at her again. Her hair was dripping onto the seat, her face still expressionless. Something shifted in the atmosphere. I couldn't place it, but the air felt colder. The rain had always been cold, but now it felt different. Heavier, like something had changed, like the world had shifted somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was about to happen. My hands tightened on the wheel, my eyes darting nervously between the road and her still form. And then, I heard it. A sound. Soft at first, but distinct. A rustling. A shift in the air. I looked over at her. The seat beside her was dry. Completely dry. Not a drop of water on it. My heart skipped a beat. The rain outside was torrential, but the passenger seat, it was bone dry. I reached over instinctively, but as my fingers brushed the edge of the seat, I pulled back sharply. The woman was gone. The seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes flicked frantically across the interior of the car. There was no sign of her. Not a trace. No wet footprints, no damp clothing, nothing. Just the empty passenger seat. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was I sleep-deprived, hallucinating from the endless driving in the storm? I turned the car off, staring at the empty seat. The sound of the rain against the car was deafening now. My thoughts scrambled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I knew, deep down, that I hadn't imagined it. She had been there. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. Of course. The battery had been low for hours, but I hadn't expected it to die right now. I took a deep breath and started the car again, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I had to keep moving, had to get out of this storm. But the unease gnawed at me. Where had she gone? How had she vanished? My mind raced, questions tumbling over one another, but there were no answers. Just silence. As I drove on, the rain didn't stop. It was as if it was pouring even harder now. The lights ahead seemed to blur, and the road stretched on endlessly. I could feel something watching me from the darkness, from the rain-slicked road. Something I couldn't see but could sense. I had no idea who she was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. And I never would be again. The road stretched on, but with every mile, I felt farther from the truth. The storm still raged. The car sped through the rain, the windshield wipers working overtime as I kept my eyes on the road ahead. But the image of that empty passenger seat haunted me. My thoughts kept racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was no explanation for what had just happened, no logical reason why she had disappeared. Every now and then, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there, watching me. But the mirror reflected nothing but the dark, wet road behind me, disappearing into the night. The radio crackled to life suddenly, breaking the silence. The static gave way to a distorted voice, the kind you get when the signal is weak. "You're not alone," the voice whispered. My heart leapt in my chest. I slammed my hand onto the dial, trying to turn it off, but the voice continued. "She's still with you." My fingers trembled as I fumbled with the radio. The voice was faint but unmistakable, cutting through the static. I could hear a low hum, almost as if it were coming from within the car itself. I turned the volume all the way down, but it didn't stop. I looked at the rearview mirror again. This time, I thought I saw something, a fleeting movement. A figure, or maybe just the way the lights flickered in the rain. I turned my head sharply, my pulse quickening. Nothing. I shook my head, trying to focus. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality, worn thin by the endless road and the storm that had been going on for hours. But then, I heard it again. A soft rustling. A sound like wet clothes shifting, as though someone was moving in the seat next to me. I dared not look. My heart thudded in my chest, but I kept my eyes fixed on the road, the headlights cutting through the rain. I had to keep going. I had to get out of here, away from whatever this was. But the air inside the car was growing colder. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. It was as though something had seeped in, something otherworldly, filling the car with its presence. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, oppressive, pressing down on me. The radio buzzed again, louder this time, crackling with static. "She's waiting," the voice rasped. My grip on the wheel tightened, knuckles turning white. I fought to stay calm, to make sense of everything. But my mind was unraveling, each passing second making it harder to focus. I was becoming a passenger in my own life, unable to control what was happening around me. I glanced at the passenger seat again. And for the first time since she had vanished, I saw something. A faint outline, sitting in the place where the woman had been. Her figure was blurred, as if made of mist, but it was there. I could see it, a shadow in the seat, faint but unmistakable. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet road. The car jerked to a stop, and I threw open the door, nearly stumbling out onto the slick pavement. I looked around frantically. There was nothing but the rain, falling in sheets, obscuring everything. No sign of the woman. No figure in the seat. But as I turned back to the car, the radio crackled again, louder than before, cutting through the chaos of the storm. "You're already too late." A jolt of terror shot through me. I backed away from the car, my legs shaking beneath me. What did it mean? Too late for what? The voice on the radio faded as quickly as it had come, and the silence returned. I stood there for a long time, staring at the car, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The road stretched out before me, empty and desolate. The storm continued its relentless assault, but I felt no desire to get back into the car. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to end. I could feel it in my bones. I turned around and walked away, the rain soaking me through as I moved further from the car. The road was long. the storm would never stop. And I knew, deep down, that I was never going to be able to escape. The sound of tires screeching in the distance was the last thing I heard before everything went quiet. The road ahead was empty. It was as if the world had closed its doors and left me in the middle of nowhere. The storm had subsided, but the heavy weight of the silence hung over me, oppressive and thick. The only sound that remained was the faint echo of my footsteps on the wet asphalt. I didn't know what I was running from anymore, or if I was running at all. Every direction felt wrong. The voice on the radio, the figure in the seat, the sudden disappearance, it was all too much to process. My thoughts were fragmented, scattered like the rain, and the world around me felt unreal, like I was stuck in a moment that refused to pass. My mind kept drifting back to the car, to the empty seat, to the voice. As I walked, I kept my eyes on the road. It stretched out endlessly, an unbroken line that seemed to disappear into nowhere. Was I even moving forward? Or had I somehow become trapped in a loop, forced to relive this nightmare over and over again? I stopped in my tracks. The sound of tires splashing through puddles reached my ears, soft at first, distant, but unmistakable. A car. Coming closer. I looked behind me, expecting to see headlights cutting through the darkness, but the road remained barren. No sign of the car. Yet the sound of tires grew louder. It was like a phantom car, following me, but I couldn't see it. My heartbeat quickened. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt heavy, like they were anchored to the ground. The sound stopped abruptly. And then, nothing. Absolute silence. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The car. It was there. But not in the way I expected. It was parked up ahead, just at the edge of my vision, the headlights dim, like a fading memory. I knew it was my car. I knew it because the seats, the steering wheel, everything about it felt familiar. But it wasn't right. Something about it was off. The way it stood there in the rain-soaked silence, it felt more like a warning than a vehicle. I forced myself to move forward, though every step felt like I was walking into the unknown. My body screamed to stop, but I couldn't. I had to know. I reached the car and, against every instinct, opened the door. The inside was just as it had been before, wet, cold, but empty. No sign of her. No sign of anything out of place. Just the lingering chill in the air. I sat down in the driver's seat, my mind racing. Was I losing my grip? Had I imagined it all, the voice, the woman, the disappearance? It felt so real, too real to ignore. I stared at the dashboard. The radio was off, but then it flickered to life. Static crackled for a moment before the voice returned, clearer this time, its tone colder, more calculated. "You can never leave," it said. I slammed my hand against the radio, desperate to stop it, but the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You are here, with me, and you will always be." A cold gust of wind whipped through the car, and I shuddered. I tried to reach for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Trapped in the car, in the rain, in the nightmare. The voice laughed, low and distorted. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere now. It was in the car. It was in my head. And then I felt it, a hand, icy and cold, resting on my shoulder. The breath on the back of my neck. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I was never alone, and I never would be again. It wasn't the first time I had sent a letter of such importance, but it felt different. This letter, this simple act, was supposed to change everything. The envelope, sealed with careful precision, felt heavier than it should have been, as if carrying the weight of my future. I had written it with a clear mind, each word deliberately chosen, each sentence planned, each feeling laid bare. I had spent days contemplating the right approach. The decision was monumental, one that I could not take lightly. The letter was my plea, my attempt to regain control, to change the course of my life. It was addressed to someone I trusted, someone who could help guide me through the uncertainty I had been living in for months. I had no idea what would happen after it was sent, but I knew I had to take that first step. So, I dropped it in the mailbox, with a heavy heart but a sense of determination. The kind of determination that comes from knowing you are on the precipice of something life-changing. Days passed. Each morning, I woke up with the hope that something, anything, would come to me, an answer, a sign, a change. But nothing came. At least, not in the way I had expected. Then, on the 5th day after mailing the letter, I received a response. It came in the same nondescript envelope, plain white, no return address, and no postmark. I opened it cautiously, my mind racing with possibilities. The letter inside was short, concise, and yet it held a weight that made my stomach churn. The message read, "You should reconsider your decision. Changing your path is not as simple as you think. Think carefully and trust that the right course will reveal itself in time." The signature at the bottom was mine. I stared at it in disbelief. How could this be? How could I have written this? It didn't make sense. I had just sent my letter only a few days ago. How could it possibly come back to me with advice, signed by my own name? I had to reread it several times, as though doing so would somehow reveal a logical explanation, something I could grasp. But each time, it remained the same. The handwriting was unmistakable, it was mine, without a doubt. The words, though, were not my own. They didn't feel like me. Was it a joke? A cruel prank, perhaps? But there was no return address, no indication of who could have sent it. I stood in the middle of my room, the letter clenched in my hand, my thoughts spinning in circles. My heart was racing. Could it be some kind of cosmic coincidence, a mistake in the mail? Or something far more unsettling? My head was filled with doubts. How had I even come to this point? I thought I knew what I was doing, but now everything felt uncertain. Was I being guided by forces I couldn't comprehend? Had I made a choice that I would soon regret? The silence around me seemed to intensify, pressing down on me. My reflection in the window caught my eye. I saw the same face staring back, the same tired eyes. But there was something different now, a sense of unease, as though I wasn't quite alone, even though I should have been. I knew one thing for certain, this was not over. The letter still sat on the table, its presence unsettling. It wasn't just the message that disturbed me, it was the fact that I had written it, yet had no memory of doing so. My thoughts felt scattered, as though the very act of reading those words had thrown them out of alignment. I picked it up again, this time feeling the texture of the paper beneath my fingertips. It was identical to the paper I used when I wrote the original letter. Same brand, same weight. And yet, the ink, while unmistakably my own, felt different, as if it had been penned at some point in the future, in a moment when I hadn't yet made the decision to write it. Could this be some sort of trick? A twisted prank, perhaps by a friend or someone I had once confided in? But that didn't explain how they had known the exact content of my letter before it was sent. The possibility that someone had somehow read my thoughts, or even tampered with my mind, made my skin crawl. I stared at the clock, 20 minutes past 7. It was still early enough in the evening, but the growing sense of dread felt all-encompassing. The air in the room felt thicker, as if something was pressing in from all sides. I needed to know more. I needed answers. But where could I turn? I couldn't simply ignore the letter. The message seemed too urgent, too direct to be dismissed as a coincidence. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to nudge me away from my intended course, something that had the power to alter the choices I was about to make. I thought back to my original letter. It had been addressed to an old mentor of mine, someone who had always given me advice in the past, someone who had once guided me when I felt lost. I had poured my heart into that letter, explaining my dilemma, asking for their. It wasn't the first time I had sent a letter of such importance, but it felt different. This letter, this simple act, was supposed to change everything. The envelope, sealed with careful precision, felt heavier than it should have been, as if carrying the weight of my future. I had written it with a clear mind, each word deliberately chosen, each sentence planned, each feeling laid bare. I had spent days contemplating the right approach. The decision was monumental, one that I could not take lightly. The letter was my plea, my attempt to regain control, to change the course of my life. It was addressed to someone I trusted, someone who could help guide me through the uncertainty I had been living in for months. I had no idea what would happen after it was sent, but I knew I had to take that first step. So, I dropped it in the mailbox, with a heavy heart but a sense of determination. The kind of determination that comes from knowing you are on the precipice of something life-changing. Days passed. Each morning, I woke up with the hope that something, anything, would come to me, an answer, a sign, a change. But nothing came. At least, not in the way I had expected. Then, on the 5th day after mailing the letter, I received a response. It came in the same nondescript envelope, plain white, no return address, and no postmark. I opened it cautiously, my mind racing with possibilities. The letter inside was short, concise, and yet it held a weight that made my stomach churn. The message read, "You should reconsider your decision. Changing your path is not as simple as you think. Think carefully, and trust that the right course will reveal itself in time." The signature at the bottom was mine. I stared at it in disbelief. How could this be? How could I have written this? It didn't make sense. I had just sent my letter only a few days ago. How could it possibly come back to me with advice, signed by my own name? I had to reread it several times, as though doing so would somehow reveal a logical explanation, something I could grasp. But each time, it remained the same. The handwriting was unmistakable, it was mine, without a doubt. The words, though, were not my own. They didn't feel like me. Was it a joke? A cruel prank, perhaps? But there was no return address, no indication of who could have sent it. I stood in the middle of my room, the letter clenched in my hand, my thoughts spinning in circles. My heart was racing. Could it be some kind of cosmic coincidence, a mistake in the mail? Or something far more unsettling? My head was filled with doubts. How had I even come to this point? I thought I knew what I was doing, but now everything felt uncertain. Was I being guided by forces I couldn't comprehend? Had I made a choice that I would soon regret? The silence around me seemed to intensify, pressing down on me. My reflection in the window caught my eye. I saw the same face staring back, the same tired eyes. But there was something different now, a sense of unease, as though I wasn't quite alone, even though I should have been. I knew one thing for certain, this was not over. The letter still sat on the table, its presence unsettling. It wasn't just the message that disturbed me, it was the fact that I had written it, yet had no memory of doing so. My thoughts felt scattered, as though the very act of reading those words had thrown them out of alignment. I picked it up again, this time feeling the texture of the paper beneath my fingertips. It was identical to the paper I used when I wrote the original letter. Same brand, same weight. And yet, the ink, while unmistakably my own, felt different, as if it had been penned at some point in the future, in a moment when I hadn't yet made the decision to write it. Could this be some sort of trick? A twisted prank, perhaps by a friend or someone I had once confided in? But that didn't explain how they had known the exact content of my letter before it was sent. The possibility that someone had somehow read my thoughts, or even tampered with my mind, made my skin crawl. I stared at the clock, 20 minutes past 7. It was still early enough in the evening, but the growing sense of dread felt all-encompassing. The air in the room felt thicker, as if something was pressing in from all sides. I needed to know more. I needed answers. But where could I turn? I couldn't simply ignore the letter. The message seemed too urgent, too direct to be dismissed as a coincidence. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to nudge me away from my intended course, something that had the power to alter the choices I was about to make. I thought back to my original letter. It had been addressed to an old mentor of mine, someone who had always given me advice in the past, someone who had once guided me when I felt lost. I had poured my heart into that letter, explaining my dilemma, asking for their wisdom. Now, all of a sudden, this second letter appeared, casting doubt on everything I had planned. It wasn't just the content that bothered me. It was the timing. The synchronicity of it. How could I have sent a letter, received a response, and yet still be so uncertain about everything? The room seemed to grow colder, a chill creeping along the edges of my skin. I looked around, half expecting to see a shadow move, to hear something out of place. But everything was silent. Too silent. I had to make a choice. But what choice could I make? The letter suggested that I should reconsider, but there was no guidance on what I should do instead. How could I trust something I didn't understand? I turned the letter over in my hands again. My name, written at the bottom, stared back at me with a finality that made me feel as if I were trapped in some endless loop. As I sat in the growing darkness, my mind began to race. What if this was no ordinary letter? What if it was something else? Something that existed beyond time, beyond reason. Was I being manipulated by an outside force? Or was this simply my own fear manifesting, my anxiety taking shape in the form of written words? A noise broke my concentration, a soft tapping against the window. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. It was just the rain, I told myself, trying to steady my nerves. The downpour outside had only intensified, and the wind was pushing it against the glass. But there was something about the rhythm of it, something unsettling in the consistency of the sound. I stood up, walked over to the window, and glanced out into the night. The streets were empty, drenched under a thick layer of water. The faint glow of streetlights reflected off the puddles, their light flickering as if the storm itself was trying to erase all signs of life. But it was what I saw on the pavement that made my heart skip a beat. A shadow. A figure, standing at the far end of the street, completely still, as if watching. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was too tall to be a trick of the light. Too deliberate. I backed away from the window, my pulse quickening. My mind raced. Was this part of it? The letter? The warning? Could it be that whatever force was at play was not just in the letter, but out there, somewhere? Watching, waiting? A chill ran down my spine as I turned away from the window. I had to figure this out, and quickly. The letter couldn't be ignored. But now, there was something else, something in the air that felt wrong, like the space around me was thinning, and the shadows were growing darker. I stumbled back from the window, the sight of the shadows still etched in my mind. The rain hammered against the glass, its rhythmic tapping somehow more ominous now, as if the storm itself was urging me to act. I glanced at the clock, now nearly 8. The darkness outside had deepened, and with it, the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the room. The figure in the street still loomed in my thoughts, but it was the letter that called me back. It sat innocently on the table, but now I could almost feel it pulling at me. I couldn't explain it, but there was a force, a presence in the room that seemed to emanate from the paper itself. It wasn't just words on a page anymore. It had become something more. I had to do something. But what? The advice in the letter was vague, simply telling me to reconsider, to change my course. It didn't offer any clear alternative, only a suggestion that whatever I was planning was wrong. But how could I trust this mysterious voice, this thing that seemed to know so much about my life, about my thoughts? The more I tried to understand, the less I felt I knew. I reached for the letter again, almost on instinct. As my fingers brushed against it, something strange happened. The paper, which had once felt smooth and familiar, now seemed to vibrate slightly under my touch. I froze, pulling my hand back as though I had touched something alive. The room grew colder still, and my breath became visible in the air. I shivered. Something wasn't right. The letter had no reason to be like this. Nothing about it should have been unsettling. But it was. I glanced back toward the window. The figure was still there. At least, I thought it was. My vision had blurred slightly, and I couldn't be sure anymore. Maybe it was my imagination playing tricks. But the certainty I had felt moments ago, when I first saw it, was slipping away, replaced by an unsettling doubt. I needed to confront whatever was happening, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I grabbed my phone, dialed the number of a close friend, but after several rings, the call went straight to voicemail. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. I tried again and again, but the result was the same. There was no answer. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I realized that I couldn't even reach out to anyone for support. I was alone in this. I turned back to the letter, gripping it tightly in my hand. I should have burned it. I should have thrown it away and forgotten everything. But I couldn't. Something, some invisible force, was keeping me here. I had to know what it meant, what it wanted from me. The words seemed to shift on the page as I stared at them, growing darker, more vivid. The ink seemed to bleed, as though the letter was absorbing the very darkness around me, becoming one with the night. And then, as I watched in disbelief, the signature at the bottom of the letter began to change. My own name morphed before my eyes, twisting into a version of itself that didn't look quite right. The letters were not just my name anymore, they were something else, something darker, something unfamiliar. I backed away from the table, my heart racing, but the room seemed to close in around me. The walls felt like they were narrowing, the air pressing in as if the space itself was shrinking, becoming smaller, more suffocating. And then, there it was again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't just the rain against the window. The tapping was coming from inside the room. I spun around, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. The tapping grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sickening feeling that it was coming from the direction of the letter. Something was inside it, something that was alive, something that was moving. With trembling hands, I reached for the letter once more, my mind a blur of confusion and fear. I had to stop this. I had to stop whatever was happening before it consumed me. But as my fingers touched the letter again, the room went completely silent. The rain outside stopped. The tapping stopped. Everything was still. Too still. And then, the voice came. It wasn't from the letter. It wasn't from the window. It was inside my head, clear and cold. Do not ignore the message, it said, its tone distant but unmistakable. Change your course, or it will be too late. The voice was mine. I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. How could this be? I couldn't be hearing my own thoughts, could I? I turned and looked toward the door, my eyes wild, my mind reeling. I knew something was coming for me, but I had no idea what it was or how to stop it. All I knew was that the letter was just the beginning. Whatever force was behind it was still out there, watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. And I had no idea what that move should be. The room was suffocating, the silence almost unbearable. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel the pulse in my neck thudding with the intensity of my panic. The voice in my head, my voice, had left me with no doubt. I was no longer alone in this. Whatever was happening was not just a coincidence. It wasn't a prank or a mistake. It was real, and it was following me. I stumbled away from the table, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the letter, the one thing in the room that seemed to be the center of this madness. I had to make a choice. I could run, get away from it all, but would that even help? What if the letter wasn't just some warning? What if it was something else? I had no idea who or what was behind this, but I knew it wasn't going to stop until I figured it out. I reached for the letter again, determined to understand its meaning, to find a clue that would give me an answer, or at least some sense of control. As I unfolded it, my hands trembled, the paper cold and damp in my grasp. The words were still there, those same cryptic lines telling me to reconsider my actions. But now, something new was emerging. The ink had started to change again. Slowly, but unmistakably, the letters were fading and reappearing in a different arrangement. The words began to form sentences that seemed as though they were being written in real time, as though someone else was composing them in the space between my thoughts. The handwriting was a perfect mirror of mine, but somehow more deliberate, more commanding. "Don't go any further," the letter read. "This is your final warning." I froze. My mind raced. This wasn't just a letter, it was a guide, a map, and a threat all rolled into one. Whoever or whatever was behind it had been watching me, learning my habits, my desires. And now, it was trying to control me. I heard a knock at the door. It was faint at first, a soft tap, but then it grew louder, more insistent, like a countdown. The knock seemed to echo through my head, synchronized with my heartbeat. I couldn't ignore it. I had to see who, or what, was on the other side. I walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I could hear the faintest whispering in the air. It wasn't a sound I could place, but it was there, just on the edge of my hearing, like a whisper from the past. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand was inches from the handle, but something inside me screamed not to open it. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't. Not now. I twisted the doorknob. The door swung open with a suddenness that made my heart jump. But there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway, drenched in the same darkness that had consumed the rest of the house. The air was thick with tension, as though something was waiting for me, watching me from the shadows. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, glancing left and right. The silence was suffocating, but nothing moved. No footsteps, no figures, no sounds except the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. I started to walk. Each step felt like it was leading me further into a place I couldn't escape. I needed to know what was happening, what this letter meant, what the force behind it all wanted from me. Suddenly, I felt the cold pressure of someone, or something, behind me. My breath caught in my throat, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. The hallway stretched out before me, endless, dark, and oppressive. But then, a sound broke the silence, a soft rustling from the direction of the letter, still sitting on the table back in the room. My instinct screamed at me to return, but I couldn't. Something had changed. The room felt wrong, almost as if the letter was calling to me in ways I didn't understand. I turned back toward the room, but as I did, the hallway seemed to stretch further. It twisted, contorted, until the door I had just opened was no longer visible. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled forward, now feeling completely disoriented. I had walked down this hallway 1,000 times before, but now everything was different. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting with each step I took. I stopped, unable to move any further. Something was coming. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. The very air seemed to press down on me, thick with dread. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but it was dead. The screen remained blank, no sign of life. Then, in the dim light ahead of me, I saw it. A figure. A shadow, standing just at the edge of the darkness. The shape of a person, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice caught in my chest. The shadow didn't respond, didn't shift, just watched me, its presence almost suffocating. And then, the voice returned. "Change your course," it whispered, "or it will be too late." It was my voice again, but this time, it wasn't just a warning, it was a command. I stepped back, my pulse racing, but the shadow remained, unblinking, unmoving. I realized then that I had no choice. Whatever this was, whatever had been pulling the strings, was in control. It wasn't asking me to make a decision anymore. It was telling me, and I had no idea what would happen if I didn't obey. I turned and ran, the hallway stretching endlessly before me, but I knew one thing for sure: no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the truth. I was already too far gone. I ran, my legs heavy, as if the air itself was trying to stop me. My breath was ragged, burning in my chest, but I couldn't slow down. The darkness seemed to pulse with each step I took, the walls narrowing, distorting, as though the house itself was closing in around me. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? All sense of reality had blurred. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror, but one thought pierced through the chaos: I have to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't find the door. I knew the way. I had walked this hallway 1,000 times before, but now it was different. The door that should have been ahead of me, the exit, was gone. The house was swallowing me whole. The whispering voice, my own voice, continued to echo in my mind: change your course, or it will be too late. I stumbled, tripping over nothing but the air itself, and collapsed against the wall. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding wildly, but as I pushed myself back up, the air grew still, unearningly still. The weight of it pressed against me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I didn't want to admit it, but the words in the letter were right. I had to change my course. I had been moving forward, trying to escape, but the real answer lay in what I had been running from. There was something here, something deep inside me, that I hadn't understood before. I turned slowly, my body trembling with fear. The hallway behind me was no longer empty. The figure was still there, but now it seemed clearer. A woman. Her outline was faint, but there was no mistaking it. She was standing perfectly still, facing me, her face hidden in the shadows. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of some invisible force. She stepped forward, her presence overwhelming. Every step she took seemed to distort the air around her, like ripples in water. I couldn't breathe. Do you understand now? The voice, my voice, came from her lips, smooth and cold. It was as if I was hearing my own thoughts spoken back to me, but not in the way I expected. Understand what? I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. What do you want from me? The woman took another step closer, and I felt a chill run through me, colder than any wind. She was so close now, I could almost feel her presence, could almost touch the void she created. She lifted her hand, and for a split second, I saw it. The letter. The one I had sent. The one I had received. She held it between her fingers, the same ink, the same handwriting, but it was shifting. The words were rearranging again, as if they were alive. You've already made your choice, she said, her voice a murmur that seemed to reverberate in my skull. And now, you must live with it. I shook my head, trying to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. No. I didn't mean to. She tilted her head, a motion that was almost too fluid, too unnatural. Her eyes, if she had any, were hidden beneath the shadows, but I could feel them, feel her gaze on me, drilling into my very soul. Everyone makes choices, she whispered. Some are irreversible. You know this now. The letter was never a warning, not really. It was the moment you sealed your fate. Terror gripped me, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a coincidence. The letter wasn't some random occurrence. It was part of something bigger, something that had been set in motion the moment I'd sent it. I didn't mean to, I repeated, my voice cracking. I don't want this. You never had a choice, she said softly, her tone almost comforting. The path was already laid out for you. You were always going to choose this. And now, you must face the consequences. Her words felt like ice, chilling my very bones. It was too much. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was nothing I could do. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, and the house around me felt as though it were suffocating me, closing in tighter, making it impossible to breathe. The woman reached out with a cold, pale hand and touched my cheek. Her touch sent a shock through me, like static electricity, but it wasn't the sensation I expected. It was colder, much colder. Her fingers were sharp, like ice against my skin. And then, just like that, she vanished. Disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone in the hallway, trembling. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The silence in the house was deafening, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than ever. But it wasn't just the fear anymore. It was something else, a deep, sinking feeling that I couldn't shake. The letter. The woman. Everything had changed. I was no longer the same. I had made a choice, and now I had to live with it. The voice, the warning, the consequences, they weren't just part of this world anymore. They were part of me. And as I sat there, alone in the dark, I realized there was no escaping it. The letter had returned, but it hadn't just been a message. It had been a part of me all along. And now, it would follow me forever. I'd never been one for small, hidden places. I prefer the open, the busy, the places that don't feel like they're holding secrets. But that day, walking through the narrow alley on a quiet street, something drew me in. A little cafe, tucked away between two tall buildings, almost hidden from the world, had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. I had walked this street countless times before, but I'd never noticed the cafe before. It wasn't even in the usual style of the buildings around it, as if it belonged to another time or place. A small, wooden sign hung above the door, La Boheme. There was something old-fashioned about it, but in a way that felt warm, inviting. The heavy door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. Immediately, the smell of fresh coffee and baked pastries enveloped me, something I hadn't realized I had been craving. The place was small, just a few tables, each with a dim lamp hanging above, casting a soft golden light. The air was thick with a quiet hum of conversation, though there were only a handful of people inside. The barista, a woman with dark, wavy hair, smiled warmly as I approached the counter. "What can I get you?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure. "Just a coffee," I said finally, my mind racing, as if something about this place was oddly familiar, yet foreign. "Coming right up," she replied, and the sound of the espresso machine filled the quiet space. I sat at one of the tables by the window, the glass slightly fogged from the cold air outside. As I sipped my coffee, I looked around. The cafe was charming, in an understated way. Its walls were lined with old photographs and bookshelves filled with tattered novels. There was a warmth to it that made me feel at home, even though I'd never been there before. But there was something else. something I couldn't put my finger on. The patrons here didn't seem to notice each other. They were all lost in their own worlds, heads down, eyes fixed on their cups or the papers they were reading. It was as though they were here, but not really here, as if they belonged to another reality altogether. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. It was almost like the cafe was absorbing me, pulling me into its quiet, strange atmosphere. I finished my coffee quickly, feeling an unexplainable urge to leave, but when I stood up to go, I noticed something odd. The clock on the wall seemed to be ticking slower than usual, its hands moving in an unnatural way. And as I looked out the window, I realized something even more unsettling. The street outside, the very same street I had walked down moments ago, had changed. The buildings now looked different, the alley had become even more cramped, the lights above flickering like dying stars. It was as if time itself had been around this place, and I had been swallowed up by something I couldn't understand. I hurried out, my heart racing. As I turned the corner and walked back toward the main road, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The cafe was gone. The space where it had been stood empty, as if it had never existed. Confused, I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. I was sure I had just been in that cafe. I could still smell the coffee on my clothes, hear the faint hum of the espresso machine in my ears. But when I tried to look for it again, the alley was just a quiet, forgotten stretch of road. No cafe. Nothing. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. A few minutes had passed since I'd left, yet everything felt wrong. My mind was racing. What had just happened? How could a cafe disappear like that? I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I had just imagined it. Maybe it had been some strange trick of the light, or a dream. But when I reached out to text my friend Sarah, I paused. I had to tell someone. I had to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. But as soon as I began typing, my fingers froze. I felt a chill creep down my spine. What was I going to say? How could I explain something that didn't make sense? I decided to call her instead. Her phone rang, but it was strange. There was no greeting, no hello, just static. And then, a voice. Low, distorted. It wasn't Sarah's. "Are you sure it was real?" the voice asked. My blood ran cold. It sounded like my own voice. Before I could respond, the line went dead. Shaking, I put my phone back in my pocket and looked around. The street now felt empty, the world quiet. It was as though I had been pulled into some other version of reality, one that didn't fit with the world I knew. But that cafe, it had been real. Or had it? The feeling of unease clung to me all night, and when morning came, I decided to go back. I had to. I needed answers. The only problem was that when I reached the alley again, there was nothing. No cafe. Not even the faintest trace of where it had stood the day before. It was as if the place had never existed. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't tell anyone. And now, as I sit here writing this, I wonder if I'm the only one who remembers. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went back to the alley, hoping to find some sign, some trace of the cafe that had vanished so suddenly. But it was gone. Completely. I asked a few people nearby if they knew about a cafe called La Boheme. The responses were all the same, confused looks, polite shrugs, and a blank silence that made my stomach turn. No one had ever heard of it. One woman even laughed, saying that there was never anything in that alley but an old storehouse. I felt a chill creep down my spine. Was I losing my mind? I had been so sure the cafe had existed. The smell of the coffee, the soft hum of the place, the barista's smile. Everything felt real. Yet now, it seemed like the entire thing had been a figment of my imagination. The more I thought about it, the more I began to doubt myself. Was it possible I had imagined it all? Could I have dreamt the whole thing up in some half-dazed state? But then again, how could I explain the strange voice on the phone? It had been my voice. My words. I couldn't focus on anything that day. At work, I kept catching myself staring at the clock, lost in thought, waiting for something to happen. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I kept quiet. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the cafe, its warm lights, the scent of coffee lingering in the air. As the days passed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back to the alley every day after work, hoping to see some clue, some explanation. But each time, it was as if I was chasing a ghost. The alley remained the same, empty and unchanged, with no sign of the cafe, not even a faint memory. One evening, just when I was about to give up, I noticed something strange. There was a small, folded piece of paper stuck under a brick near the edge of the alley. I pulled it free and unfolded it, feeling my heart race as I read the words written in a hurried scrawl. "You shouldn't be looking for me. You don't want to find me again." I stared at the note for a long moment. It was signed with my name. My breath caught in my throat. My name. How could this be possible? How could someone know to write this note, and why was it in my handwriting? The words felt like a warning, like I was being pushed further into something I didn't understand. My hand shook as I folded the note back up and stuffed it into my pocket. But the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone in this strange puzzle, refused to leave me. That night, I dreamed about the cafe again. But this time, it was different. The barista was there, but her smile was no longer warm. It was a cold, twisted thing, as if she knew something I didn't. "You were never meant to leave," she said softly, her voice carrying the same static I had heard on the phone. "You belong here now." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream felt too real. I wasn't sure if I had been dreaming at all. The line between reality and something else was starting to blur. The following day, I decided to stop searching. I told myself it was all in my head. But as I walked down the street, my eyes were drawn to the alley again. And this time, I didn't hesitate. I walked down the narrow path, heart racing, and there was La Boheme standing as if nothing had ever changed. I couldn't believe it. I approached the door slowly, almost afraid to touch it, afraid to open it and step back into whatever world I had found myself in. The door creaked open on its own, as if it was expecting me. Inside, the barista was standing behind the counter, waiting, smiling. But this time, there was no warmth in her eyes. Her smile was thin, almost predatory. "You came back," she said, her voice like a soft whisper, almost drowned out by the hum of the espresso machine. "You should have listened. Now there's no turning back." I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, to forget everything. But my feet felt heavy, as if they were glued to the floor. I could feel the cafe pulling me in, as if it was some kind of trap. I had no choice, I said aloud, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to myself. I had to know. The barista tilted her head, the smile never leaving her face. You don't need to know anything. You're here now. And here, there's no leaving. I stepped backward, but as I did, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a pressure building up inside me, like something was closing in. The air around me grew thick and heavy, the walls pressing in, the room becoming smaller, darker. And then, without warning, everything went black. I woke up with a jolt. My head was spinning, my vision blurred. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. But as I slowly came to, I realized I was no longer inside the cafe. I was back on the street, the alley stretching out in front of me. The cafe was gone again. I stood frozen in place, staring at the empty space where it had been. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, half expecting the barista to appear, or some other sign that I wasn't alone. But the street was silent. No one was there. And that's when I realized there was no way out. The cafe wasn't a place I could visit. It wasn't something I could leave behind. I had crossed a line. And now, it seemed, it was following me. Days passed, but the sense of unease never left me. Every time I looked at the alley, the memory of La Boheme loomed large. It had become an obsession. I tried to convince myself that I had simply imagined the whole thing, perhaps it had been a dream, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something wasn't right. The next few days were a blur. At work, I couldn't focus. My colleagues asked if I was okay, but I just nodded, not trusting myself to explain what was happening. How could I explain it? That strange cafe that no one seemed to remember, the note written in my own hand, the feeling that I was being pulled into something dark and unfathomable. I found myself walking past the alley every day, but I never dared to turn down it again. The temptation was always there, like a whisper in the back of my mind, telling me to return, to face whatever it was that I couldn't escape. But I knew I couldn't go back. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I received a text. The message was from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, a sense of dread creeping over me. You haven't learned your lesson yet, have you? I stared at the words, my heart racing. There was no name attached, no explanation. Just the cold, unnerving message. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the cafe, to whatever had happened to me. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just a prank. But my mind couldn't let go. I started to wonder, was there someone else who knew about La Boheme, someone else who had been there, someone who had gone through the same thing I was experiencing? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed to find answers. I couldn't keep running from this. The next day, I returned to the alley. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached the familiar spot where the cafe had once stood. It was still empty, just a small stretch of pavement and an old, crumbling building at the end. No sign of the cafe. No sign of anything. But this time, something was different. There was a small card, wedged between the bricks near the ground, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. On it was a single line of text. You're not supposed to remember. I stared at the card, feeling the words echo in my mind. It didn't make sense. If I wasn't supposed to remember, why was it still haunting me? Why was I being drawn back here, again and again? I felt a sudden shift in the air around me. The temperature dropped, and a faint hum filled the alley, like the sound of an old electrical machine. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could sense something moving just beyond my vision, something watching me, waiting. I turned around, but the street was empty. No one in sight. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, I heard it. A soft sound, like a door creaking open, followed by the faintest murmur of voices. It was coming from the direction of the alley's end, where the cafe had once been. I couldn't help myself. I stepped forward, my feet moving on their own accord, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the spot where the cafe should have been, I felt a cold gust of wind blow past me, sending a shiver down my spine. The air felt heavy, thick, as though the atmosphere itself was alive, pressing in on me. And then, I saw it. The door to the cafe. It was there. It stood open, inviting me inside. I couldn't believe it. How was it possible? How could it have returned after all this time? My hand reached for the door, trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I stepped inside before I could stop myself, the door closing softly behind me. The inside of the cafe was just as I remembered it, cozy, dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. But something was different this time. The atmosphere felt off, like the walls themselves were watching me. And there she was, the barista. She stood behind the counter, her smile as cold as I have remembered. But this time, there was something more in her eyes. Something predatory. Something dark. "You've come back," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness of the cafe. "I thought you'd forgotten. But you never do you?" I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing heart. "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Why does no one remember it? Why am I the only one who can see it?" The barista's smile grew wider, and she stepped closer to me. "Because you're not meant to leave. La Boheme isn't just a cafe. It's a place outside of time, outside of reality. Once you enter, you belong to it. You belong to me." Her voice was low, almost hypnotic, and I felt my body freeze, as though I couldn't move. The cafe seemed to pulse with life, the walls closing in, the room growing darker with every passing second. "You can't escape it," she whispered. "You can't escape me." I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't just stumbled upon this place. I had been chosen. And now, there was no way out. I could feel the weight of her words sinking into me, the gravity of the situation finally crashing down. She wasn't just speaking to me, she was pulling me into her world, a world where nothing was as it seemed. I tried to gather myself, to push back against the cold, creeping sense of inevitability that surrounded me. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, locked in place by something far more powerful than my fear. Her smile never faltered, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite understand. Was it malice? Or was it pity? She stepped closer, her movements slow, almost deliberate. Each step felt like a countdown to something I wasn't prepared to face. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of centuries. "This cafe, this place, it doesn't just exist in your world. It exists in many. It exists in between. My heart raced, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. In between what? My mind screamed, but I couldn't force the words out. The air around me thickened, pressing in like a storm cloud, and for the first time, I realized that the space in the cafe felt wrong, distorted. The shadows on the walls didn't match the light sources. The music that played was too distant, too faint, like it came from a place I couldn't reach. Nothing about it was real. I opened my mouth to ask her to explain, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my body refusing to obey, like my very presence in this place had sealed my fate. "You're here now," she continued, her eyes gleaming with something akin to satisfaction. "There's no leaving, not once you've crossed the threshold. You'll stay with me, and with this." I felt a shiver race down my spine, and I stumbled backward, suddenly aware that the walls were closing in around me. The cafe wasn't just shrinking physically, it was tightening, pulling in all the space around us into something far more claustrophobic. I felt like I was suffocating, like the air was growing thick, pushing against me. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse, pleading. "I don't belong here. I don't want this." But her face remained unreadable, her smile cold, her eyes calculating. "It's not about what you want, it's about what you are. And you are part of this now." As if on cue, the door to the cafe creaked open again, slowly, unnaturally so. A cold gust of wind rushed in, swirling the dust on the floor. I could hear a faint whispering, like a conversation happening just out of reach. The air crackled with an eerie tension, and I felt a presence, something far older than anything I had ever known, something watching from beyond the threshold. The barista took a step back, as if allowing something to enter. And then I saw it. It was a figure, tall and dark, cloaked in shadows that seemed to devour the light. It moved with an unnatural grace, its form shifting and rippling as it approached the counter. The room seemed to bend around it, warping in ways I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but the figure's silence was deafening. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, and whatever was coming toward me wasn't something I could escape. The figure stopped just short of me, its presence so overwhelming that I could feel my legs shaking beneath me. It leaned forward, its face obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes upon me. Cold, empty eyes. And then, a voice, deep, rumbling, like the sound of thunder rolling in the distance, spoke. "You've crossed into our world. There's no going back." The words felt like they were tearing at the fabric of my mind. My heart hammered in my chest, and I was sure I would collapse right there on the floor. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. The barista's voice interrupted the silence, though it was now tinged with a strange excitement. "You see, once you've been chosen, there's no choice left. This place, this cafe, it needs you. Just like it needed him, and her, and everyone before you." My mind reeled, unable to process the words. Chosen? Needed? What was she talking about? Was I just another pawn in some grand, unexplainable game? The figure took another step closer, its movement so fluid it seemed to glide. The coldness intensified, settling deep in my bones. I felt my sense of reality slipping away, as though the world around me was becoming nothing more than a mirage. "You belong to us now," the figure said, its voice like a death knell, final and all-encompassing. I couldn't speak, couldn't argue. My thoughts were drowning in a sea of confusion and dread. But then, suddenly, I was aware of something else, a sharp, frantic ringing, like a phone off in the distance. A faint, insistent noise that seemed to pierce through the haze around me. I turned, and there it was, a phone, sitting on the counter, illuminated by a cold light. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew it was for me. I stumbled forward, compelled by some force I couldn't understand. The figure and the barista didn't move, didn't stop me. They watched, waiting. I grabbed the phone, my fingers shaking as I pressed it to my ear. A voice on the other end, familiar, too familiar, spoke in a calm, soothing tone. "It's not too late," the voice said, but it wasn't my voice. It was my own, distorted, coming from somewhere beyond. "Get out," the voice urged. "Leave before it's too late." My heart skipped a beat. How was it possible? Who was this? How could I even hear this? I glanced up from the phone, and the figure was gone. The cafe, too, was changing, flickering, like a fading photograph. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling bowing, as if the entire place was collapsing in on itself. The barista's eyes were wide now, her smile no longer a smile, but a twisted grimace. She took a step back, her expression one of disbelief, fear even. And then it happened. The phone fell from my hand, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Everything around me began to dissolve, like sand slipping through my fingers. The air went cold, and the hum of electricity began to vibrate in the walls. I could feel the world unraveling. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me shifted. The walls bent, warping like liquid. The figure's voice, deep and unyielding, echoed in my ears, as if it had never left. "You can't escape. You never could." And then, darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the faintest sound of a bell ringing. The bell of La Boheme. I woke up gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat, heart pounding against my chest as if it wanted to break free. The room was familiar, too familiar, my small apartment, the morning light filtering through the blinds. It was quiet. No strange shadows, no warped air. Just the hum of the city outside, the normal sounds of a Tuesday morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something had changed. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling as I touched my face, my arms, checking for signs that I was still me. There were no marks, no scars, nothing to show that the cafe or its inhabitants had ever existed. It felt as if the entire night had been a dream, a nightmare so vivid that it was hard to believe I wasn't still trapped in it. But the fear, that unshakable dread, it lingered. In the pit of my stomach, in the way my thoughts scrambled to make sense of what had happened. The phone call, the cafe that no one else seemed to remember, the figure who spoke with my voice, it couldn't have been just a dream. Could it? I stood up, my legs unsteady, and moved toward the window. The sun was rising over the city, casting a warm glow on the street below. People walked by, oblivious to whatever nightmare I had just experienced. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but the images from the cafe kept flashing in my mind, the barista's knowing smile, the shadowy figure, the feeling of being trapped in a place that didn't belong to the world I knew. The ringing of my phone cut through the silence, and I froze. My stomach twisted in knots. I had no reason to believe it would be anything normal. The display showed an unknown number, but the dread that filled me was unmistakable. With trembling hands, I answered. Hello? My voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Are you okay? It was a woman's voice, soft and familiar. A voice I recognized, but I couldn't place it at first. My throat tightened. Who is this? You don't remember me, do you? She asked, her tone both concerned and strangely distant. I'm the one who gave you that message. You need to remember. I felt my pulse spike. Message? What are you talking about? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice that sounded as though it were coming from miles away, she said, You must leave. It's not over. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. What do you mean? What's not over? But there was no reply. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling a cold sweat break out over my skin. My head was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle shifting but never quite fitting together. I was awake, yes, but something was wrong. A loud knock on my door startled me, causing my heart to skip a beat. I hadn't heard anyone come up to my apartment. Hesitating for only a moment, I moved toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, the dim light from the ceiling above casting long shadows across the floor. But then, lying on the mat in front of my door, was a small, folded piece of paper. It looked old, its edges curled slightly as if it had been lying around for a long time. I bent down, picked it up, and opened it. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect, and as I read the words, a chill ran through me. La Boheme is always waiting. You can never leave. My breath caught in my throat. The words were a jolt to my memory. The cafe, the figure, the barista's smile. I had heard those words before. That place was more than just a cafe, it was something that reached into the very fabric of reality, pulling people into its web, and once you were inside, you couldn't escape. I crumpled the paper in my hand, my mind racing. How could this be real? How could I have crossed into that place and then come back, only to be pulled back again? It was like I was trapped in some endless cycle, caught between the worlds of the living and the unreal. Suddenly, the room felt too small, the walls too close. The air grew heavy, the familiar hum of the city outside now muffled, as if something was pressing in from all sides. I backed away from the door, turning in a frantic circle. My thoughts were jumbled, like I was missing something important. And then, I heard it. That familiar sound. A soft, ringing bell, echoing faintly, as though it was coming from a distant memory. I froze, my blood running cold. It was the sound of the bell from La Boheme. I rushed to the window, pulling back the blinds. The street was still the same, the people moving in their ordinary ways. But something had changed. The air was wrong, the shadows longer, more defined. I could almost see the cafe, just at the edge of my vision, tucked away in the narrow alley, as if waiting for me to find it again. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. I had to leave, to get away from whatever this was before it consumed me entirely. But as I turned away from the window, I saw it. A figure standing across the street, watching me through the glass. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood. My heart stopped. I knew that figure. It was the same shadowy presence from the cafe. I took a step back, my chest tightening. The figure raised its hand, slowly, as if acknowledging me. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. The cafe had found me again. And this time, I wasn't sure if I could outrun it. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me was almost deafening, and yet, the room was filled with a strange quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if it was trying to swallow every sound whole. I had arrived at this old hotel for a business trip, something I didn't look forward to. It was the middle of the week, and I had just wrapped up a long, draining day of meetings. A comfortable bed and a quiet night were all I needed. But, as soon as I stepped into the lobby, there was something about this place that unsettled me. The hotel was old, an antique relic in the heart of the city. It wasn't that it was in disrepair, but there was an eerie vibe to it. The wallpaper was faded, the carpets worn, and the heavy scent of age hung in the air. The receptionist, a woman with dark, vacant eyes, checked me in with a mechanical smile and handed me the key. Her hand lingered a little too long on mine when she gave it to me, and that small moment made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The hallway was narrow, the air cool but still, with only the faintest echo of my footsteps. I tried to shake off the odd feeling gnawing at me and continued toward my room. It was room number 28. I wasn't superstitious, but as I approached the door, I couldn't help but notice how the number was slightly crooked, as though it had been moved or replaced. I brushed it off as nothing more than an accident. When I opened the door, the room was dimly lit. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a half-light that made the space feel both closed off and distant. The bed was neatly made, the furniture dark wood, and the walls lined with strange, vintage pictures of landscapes that I couldn't quite place. The mirror above the dresser caught my attention as soon as I entered. There was something odd about it. The reflection seemed slightly off, as if the light in the room wasn't quite right. I moved closer, inspecting the ornate frame, but when I looked back at the mirror, I could have sworn the angle of the reflection had shifted. I blinked, trying to dismiss the thought, but there it was again, a subtle, unsettling shift. I let out a quiet breath, trying to push the unease away. I set my bag down and walked to the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting a dull glow against the dark sky. I checked my phone, then glanced back at the mirror, and that's when I saw it. A movement. In the reflection, something shifted behind me, just a shadow, a fleeting shape. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. The bed was still perfectly made, the dresser untouched, and the curtains hung still. There was no sign of anyone being in the room with me. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I must have been tired. My thoughts were jumbled after the long day. I turned away from the mirror and walked to the bathroom, turning on the tap to wash my face and cool down. The cold water splashed against my skin, bringing a small sense of relief. But as I looked up into the bathroom mirror, my reflection didn't match my actions. I was still holding the towel, but the reflection showed me stepping away from the sink, as if I were standing on the other side of the room. My blood ran cold. I spun back around, my heart thudding in my chest. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were inching closer, closing in. I stepped back toward the main room, and in the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the reflection of myself in the mirror, but now it was different. I wasn't alone in the reflection. There, just behind me, stood a figure tall, obscured by shadows, but unmistakably present. My breath hitched in my throat, my legs frozen in place. I couldn't look away, but I couldn't make myself move either. I was trapped between the real and the reflected, unable to process what I was seeing. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting, watching. Suddenly, a loud knock at the door jerked me from my trance. I jumped, startled. My heart pounded in my ears, but I quickly moved to the door, trying to shake off the dread clinging to me. When I opened it, no one was there. Only the empty hallway stretched out before me, the silence pressing against me like a heavy weight. I stood there, staring down the hallway for what felt like an eternity, the silence unnerving. I could still feel the weight of the reflection on me, a sense of unease settling in my chest like a cold stone. The figure in the mirror, the one I had seen in the corner of my eye, was still there in my mind, a constant presence, even though I knew the room was empty. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it, my breathing shallow. I was exhausted, and yet, sleep seemed impossible now. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none came. Only the steady thrum of my heartbeat, and the lingering sensation of something else, something that had been in the room with me, hidden just out of sight. I tried to calm my nerves by sitting down on the bed, running my hands through my hair, trying to ground myself. The knock at the door had been an unsettling interruption, but I didn't know what to make of it. There was no one out there, no sign of a prank, no explanation. I glanced nervously at the mirror again, half expecting the figure to still be there, but it was empty. Just the reflection of my room, quiet and still. But despite the stillness, the sense of unease lingered like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over the room. I stood up slowly, feeling as though the walls themselves were somehow watching me. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint hum of the lights, seemed to echo in the silence, amplifying the weight of the moment. I told myself I was just tired. It was late, after all. My thoughts were distorted, playing tricks on me. The mirror? It must have been a trick of the light. I'd had a long day. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I walked to the window again, trying to focus on the world outside. The city was alive with lights, distant sounds of traffic, a steady hum of life. Yet, here in this room, I felt completely isolated. A sense of suffocating isolation wrapped around me, and I couldn't shake it. My reflection in the window mirrored my thoughts, fragmented, distorted. I glanced back at the mirror. It seemed impossible, but for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something shift in the reflection again. A movement, just a shadow, but this time, it seemed to linger longer, more deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to face the mirror, slowly. Nothing. My reflection was still. Just me. Standing there in the dim light, my face pale, my eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. I exhaled in relief, brushing the thought from my mind. It was nothing. There was no one here but me. But when I looked closer, I noticed something strange in the reflection. A slight distortion, like the mirror itself was bending, warping, almost like it was breathing. I blinked hard, trying to focus. My eyes scanned the surface of the glass, searching for an explanation, anything to dismiss the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. And then it hit me, the reflection was wrong. Not just the figure behind me, but the whole room. The angle of the light was off. The furniture was slightly different. The bed was in a different position, the curtains drawn in a way I hadn't left them. It was like the reflection wasn't showing the room as it was now, but as it had been. I felt the floor beneath me shift, as though the ground had suddenly become unstable. The walls closed in again, tighter this time. My heart began to race. I stepped closer to the mirror, my hands trembling. As I stared, the room and the reflection grew more distorted, more alien. I could see myself in the reflection, but there was someone standing beside me now, a tall, shadowy figure, its face obscured by darkness. It was just a shape at first, but then, with growing horror, I realized that it was standing closer, moving toward me. It's just a trick of the light, I told myself, but the words felt hollow. The figure was moving in the reflection, matching my every movement, but it wasn't me. It was standing just behind me now, too close, too real. I spun around, and for the first time, I felt the coldness of the air shift. The room felt empty, silent, but the presence behind me was undeniable. My pulse thundered in my ears. I dared not look into the mirror again, but I could feel the presence, right there. I backed away, stumbling toward the door. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this room, away from whatever this was. I yanked the door open, and the hallway greeted me with its quiet, oppressive emptiness. But something was wrong. The hallway, it was different. The walls, the lighting, the pictures, it all looked the same, but something felt off. Like it had been altered. The hallway stretched on farther than it had when I had first arrived, and the door I had just exited from seemed to have shifted, its number now obscured by the shadows. I stood there in the doorway for a moment, heart pounding, unsure of what I had just witnessed. Was it the exhaustion? The stress? Or had the hotel, had it done something to me? I stepped back into the room. My mind was spinning. I had to find a way to make sense of this, to rationalize it, but nothing made sense. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if something truly unnatural was happening. I walked to the window again, looking out over the city. The lights below twinkled, a calm sight in stark contrast to the growing chaos in my mind. I reached for the phone to call the front desk, but then I froze. What if the mirror is showing the truth? I gripped the phone tighter. The thought haunted me, what if this hotel, this room, had a mind of its own? What if it could change the way time moved, the way space bent? Was I caught in something I couldn't escape? Suddenly, the faint hum of the lights seemed louder, almost deafening. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against my chest. I turned back to the mirror, unable to resist. And there it was again. The figure. This time, it wasn't just behind me, it was beside me. It was a perfect reflection, standing just an inch away, mirroring my every movement, my every breath. But as I stared into the glass, I realized with growing terror that the reflection wasn't mine anymore. The face that stared back at me was someone else's, familiar, but twisted, distorted, like it had been pulled from my own memories. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine. The hotel was alive. And it knew me. I gasped, my breath ragged as I stumbled back from the mirror, my hand pressed against my chest, trying to steady myself. The reflection didn't move, it just stood there, unerringly still, staring back at me with eyes that weren't my own. The face, the features, everything about. It felt familiar, but there was something deeply wrong with it. It was like looking at a part of myself, but twisted, warped into something I couldn't recognize. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The face was still there, just as real as I was. But I couldn't remember who it was. I couldn't even remember how it got there. It was like the reflection had a life of its own, moving with a rhythm that I couldn't comprehend, as if it had its own agenda, its own thoughts. My heart was pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of this room. I needed to escape whatever this was. I turned away from the mirror, my legs unsteady as I backed toward the door. But before I could reach it, I heard a sound. A soft scrape, as if something was moving across the floor. I froze. The room was silent again. The scraping stopped as quickly as it had begun. "It's nothing," I told myself, but my voice cracked, betraying the fear that had taken root deep within me. I was losing control, losing my grip on reality. I reached for the door handle, but before I could turn it, I heard the knock again. The same knock, the same rhythm, as though someone was waiting on the other side of the door. No one's there, I thought, yet my hand trembled as I slowly approached. My reflection in the hallway mirror, how had I missed it? It wasn't right. The reflection in the hallway mirrored the door in front of me, but in the reflection, the door was opening, as if someone was on the other side, stepping into the room. I quickly turned around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. There was no one. "It's just your mind," I told myself again, "playing tricks on you." But the words didn't comfort me. I knew something was wrong. This hotel was wrong. This whole place felt like a distortion of reality, like it had been twisted and bent out of shape. I opened the door, stepping into the hallway cautiously. The lights flickered above, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. The hallway appeared longer than before, as though the space had expanded, and the floor creaked beneath my feet, as if the building itself was alive, groaning, shifting, breathing. I turned the corner, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, yet somehow I felt like I was moving in circles. Every turn seemed to lead me back to the same place, the same walls, the same eerie silence. Suddenly, I heard the faintest whisper, so quiet it could have been my imagination. I stopped dead in my tracks. The whispering came again, this time more distinct, clearer. It sounded like my name, but it was a voice I didn't recognize. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was something wrong about it, like it was trying to lure me somewhere. I took a hesitant step forward, but then something in the hallway caught my eye, a figure, standing at the far end, shrouded in darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't even breathe. It was just there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt the weight of its gaze, heavy and suffocating, like it could see right through me. My breath quickened, my palms sweating as I took another step back. I wasn't sure why, but I was terrified. Terrified of what I might find if I approached, terrified of what might happen if I stayed. The figure didn't move, but the air around me seemed to shift, thickening, pressing in. I tried to turn back, but my feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The hallway seemed to stretch farther, the walls closing in around me. The whispering began again, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from behind me, just at the edge of my hearing. My body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't break free from the grip this place had on me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The figure, the whisper, had vanished. I blinked, shaking my head, and for a moment, I thought it had all been a hallucination, a figment of my overworked mind. But the air still felt thick, and the silence was too heavy, too oppressive. My feet finally regained movement, and I stumbled down the hallway, frantic, trying to find an exit. The door I had entered through was nowhere to be found. The walls, the ceiling, everything was shifting. The hotel was changing again, and I was trapped in its ever-changing labyrinth. This isn't real, I told myself, my voice barely a whisper as I stumbled forward. None of this is real. But deep down, I knew the truth. This place, this hotel, it wasn't just a building, it was a living thing. And I was its prey. I don't know how long I had been wandering through the maze of hallways. Time had become meaningless here. The strange whispers had stopped, but the weight of the air was still pressing on me, the walls narrowing and shifting like they had a mind of their own. I could feel it. The hotel was alive, and it was watching me, studying me, waiting. Every corner I turned seemed to lead me deeper into the unknown. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows. The silence was maddening, broken only by the sound of my own hurried breath. I couldn't get out. No matter how many doors I opened or how many turns I made, I was still trapped. The elevator had vanished when I tried to return to the lobby. The staircase I had used to come up had disappeared as well, leaving me with only the endless hallway to explore. There was no escape. Not anymore. I was starting to lose my grip on reality. My mind was playing tricks on me, I was sure of it. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long days before the trip, or the stress of the business I had been handling, but something was off about this place. No. Something was wrong with me. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly awake. It was as if I had stepped into a dream, one that I couldn't wake up from. But then I heard it again. The sound of soft footsteps, barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. The unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking just behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath hitched in my chest. I spun around, expecting to see the same figure from earlier. But no one was there. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. But then I heard the scraping sound, like shoes dragging across the floor. I looked down at the floor, half expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the noise. But it was just the same old dusty carpet, worn and frayed in places. I tried to calm my racing heart. I needed to think. I needed to find a way out. I had to get to the lobby. I had to leave this place, whatever it was. I couldn't stay here any longer. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move, pushing through the feeling of dread that kept threatening to paralyze me. I walked faster, moving past door after door, none of them leading anywhere. My eyes kept darting to the side, scanning the hallway for any sign of escape, but it was all the same, endless and oppressive. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light spill out into the darkness. It was a dim, yellow light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My stomach twisted. I had to go there. I had to know what was behind that door. I rushed towards it, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence, growing faster with each step. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, but it was enough to make me hesitate. I didn't know why, but the closer I got, the more I felt the presence behind me again. Something was following me. I pushed the door open with a force I hadn't known I had. The room beyond was dark, with only the faintest light coming from an old, flickering lamp in the corner. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was a small room, cluttered with old furniture, an antique chair, a desk covered with yellowed papers, and a dusty mirror that hung crookedly on the wall. I stepped further inside, my mind racing. There had to be something here, something that could explain all of this. But before I could take another step, I felt a cold draft rush past me, followed by a strange sensation that I couldn't place. It was as though the temperature had dropped, and the air had become thick, heavy. I turned toward the mirror, and that's when I saw it. The reflection in the mirror was not mine. It was someone else's. A man, standing still in the middle of the room, staring back at me with hollow eyes. He wasn't moving. He was just there, in the reflection, as though he had always been there. My heart skipped a beat, and I stepped back, but the figure didn't move. It didn't even blink. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the mirror's surface. The coldness of it made my fingers tingle. I pulled my hand back quickly. The figure in the mirror remained motionless, staring at me. It was as if he was waiting for something. I turned away from the mirror, desperate to get out of the room. But before I could reach the door, I heard the footsteps again. They were closer now, right behind me. I spun around, but the man in the mirror was gone. The room was empty. There was no one there. The footsteps stopped. I was alone again. Or was I? I bolted for the door, flinging it open and stumbling out into the hallway. The world outside seemed to blur, the walls bending and twisting as I ran, desperate to escape the nightmare. I didn't know where I was going or how to get out, but I couldn't stay here. Not after everything I had seen. Suddenly, the hallway shifted again. The walls stretched, and the floors tilted, and I found myself back at the beginning. The same spot I had started, with the same mirror staring back at me. Only now, it wasn't empty. I wasn't alone. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the mirror wasn't just staring anymore. It was moving, its face slowly twisting into a grotesque smile, lips curling unnaturally wide. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, away from the mirror, but no matter how far I retreated, the reflection grew clearer. The figure's eyes seemed to lock onto mine, unblinking, as if it were aware of every single thought racing through my mind. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The hotel was toying with me, I realized. The reflection wasn't just a mirror of the room, it was a trap. It had me, it was holding me, keeping me in this loop, this maddening cycle of unreality. I tried to run, but the hallway stretched out impossibly before me, the walls closing in with each step. I reached out, fingers grasping at the air, but there was nothing to grab, no solid ground beneath me. It was as though I was suspended in some strange, suspended reality where nothing was real, least of all me. I couldn't breathe. My head felt heavy, like the very air was thickening, choking the life out of me. The room behind me, the mirror, the figure, wasn't just part of this place. It was the core of it, the very heart of whatever nightmare had taken hold of me. I spun around again, back toward the entrance of the room, thinking that maybe if I could just escape the mirror, it would stop. But as soon as my hand brushed the doorframe, everything changed. The hotel around me buckled, folding like wet paper, the corridors twisting and morphing. The soft carpet beneath my feet turned to damp wood. I could hear the creaking. Now, louder, more distinct, the sound of the walls and floorboards groaning under some unseen pressure. And there, just ahead, I saw it again. The reflection. The figure had moved from the mirror and into the hallway with me. It stood silently, a motionless shadow in the corner of my eye. I could feel its presence before I even turned toward it. I didn't have the strength to scream. The figure didn't seem to care about me anymore. It was waiting for something. I couldn't tell if it was waiting for me to act or for something else to happen. But there was no time left. I could feel it. Something was coming. The entire hotel seemed to shudder. The lights flickered once more, and this time they didn't stop. They went out completely, plunging the hallway into an eerie, suffocating darkness. I could still hear the figure, its breathing steady and slow. Was it even breathing? Was it real? And then, in the darkness, I felt a hand on my shoulder. A cold, clammy touch, like ice sliding down my spine. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The weight of it was too much. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell to my knees, trembling, helpless. The air grew heavier still, thickening like smoke, and I heard the figure's voice, a whisper, almost too quiet to hear, but clear enough to send a wave of nausea through my chest. You shouldn't have stayed. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My eyes closed, and I let the blackness take over. When I opened them again, I was back in my room. The bed was still made. The clock on the nightstand read exactly 12:01 a.m. The room smelled faintly of dust and mildew, just like it had when I first arrived. But the mirror was cracked. The reflection no longer showed the room behind me. It showed nothing. And the figure, it was gone. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief, my pulse still racing. Maybe I was just dreaming. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I had finally escaped whatever madness the hotel had tried to force upon me. I stood, legs unsteady, and walked to the door. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there before the hotel found a way to pull me back into its grip. But as I stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me. And I heard it again. The footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, echoing through the darkness. The sound of someone, something, coming closer. The mirror wasn't finished with me yet.
This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.